Hello, night listener, and welcome to Little Nightmare. I'm Emma, and tonight I'll be keeping you company to help you fall asleep. But before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. Story 1. The light from the single bulb in the corridor did not so much illuminate as it did push back the darkness. And even that was a reluctant, grimy effort. It swung on its cord, a slow, metronomic arc that set the shadows in the cell block to breathing. They stretched and contracted, long, thin fingers of black that caressed the iron bars, and then retreated, only to stretch again. To Granger, standing his watch on the midnight shift, it felt like the heartbeat of the place itself, a slow, somber rhythm tuned to the final, desperate breaths of the men locked within its belly. This was death row at Blackwood Penitentiary, and the air was always cold, a damp, stone-bitten chill that seeped into the bones and stayed there, a promise of the grave. But tonight, a week out from Halloween, the cold was different. It carried on it the scent of turned earth and wood smoke from the world outside. A ghost of autumn that made the institutional sterility of the prison feel like a blasphemy. He walked his route, the echoes of his own footsteps his only company. To his left, the cells, each a square of deeper darkness from which the sounds of condemned men whispered and muttered. The snores, the prayers, the soft, wet sound of weeping. It was late October 1935, and the world beyond these walls was preparing for its night of masquerade. Here, the masks were different. They were the faces men wore to hide their terror from the dawn, when the chaplain would come, when the last meal would be served, when the walk would be taken. Granger tried not to look at them as he passed, but his eyes, traitors that they were, always flickered toward the shapes in the cots. His post brought him to the end of the row, to the special cell. Cell 13. They had put Douglas in there. No one called him by his last name. He was just Douglas. He was different. That was the only word for it, the only word anyone could agree on. He had arrived in the dead of a September night, a man of average build with quiet eyes and hands that were always still. There was no paperwork that Granger ever saw, no trial mentioned, no crime specified. He was just there, a new resident in the house of the dead. And with his coming, the atmosphere in the block had changed. It was Elliot, the other guard on the shift, who first noticed the smell. Not the usual stench of sweat, fear, and disinfectant, but something else. Something clean and wild. Smells like a goddamned pumpkin patch in here. Elliot had grumbled, his voice a low rasp that fit the shadows. He was a hard man, built of cruelty and cheap whiskey. His face a roadmap of broken capillaries and bitterness. He hated the inmates, hated the job, and saved a special, virulent hatred for Douglas, whose peacefulness was a silent accusation. Granger had to admit he was right. It was the scent of pumpkin flesh, that waxy, vegetal smell you get when you carve a jack-o'-lantern, mixed with the spicy tang of cinnamon and the dark, sweet promise of decay. It was a Halloween smell, utterly out of place, in the tomb-like silence of the cell block. It seemed to emanate from Douglas's cell, a fragrant bubble in the stagnant air. And then there were the lights. Not the electric lights, but other lights. Small, flickering points of orange that would sometimes appear in the corner of Granger's vision, dancing at the edge of the bars of cell 13 like candle flames seen from a great distance. When he turned his head to look directly, they were gone, leaving only the afterimage on his retina and the faint, sweet scent of burning wax. Tonight, as he paused outside Douglas's cell, he saw it again. A soft, pulsing glow from within, illuminating the man's serene face. Douglas was sitting on the edge of his cot, his hands resting on his knees, palms up. In the center of each palm, a small, perfect flame hovered, no bigger than a penny, casting a warm, buttery light that pushed the shadows of the cell into respectful corners. They did not burn him. They simply were little worlds of contained fire. "Evening, Mr. Granger," Douglas said, his voice quiet, a smooth stone in a turbulent stream. The flames vanished, leaving the cell in near darkness, the afterglow painting purple blotches in Granger's sight. Douglas Granger nodded, his throat tight. He had seen this before, and other things. He had seen Douglas touch the forehead of Jenkins in cell 7, who had been screaming for his mother for 3 nights straight. A single touch, and Jenkins had fallen into a deep, peaceful sleep, a small, contented smile on his face for the first time since his sentencing. The next morning, he walked to the chair without a sound, his eyes clear and calm. He had seen the dead fly, its tiny body crushed on the window ledge, twitch, and then buzz back into the air, its wings whole. He had seen the small, perfect apple, red and gleaming, appear on Douglas's cot one morning, its skin dewy as if just picked. Elliot had confiscated it, snarling about contraband, and taken a huge, defiant bite. He had spat it out immediately, his face contorted in disgust. Tastes like ashes, he dehissed, and the apple, when it hit the floor, had rotted in seconds, collapsing into a mound of black pulp and wriggling worms. Miracles, that's what they were. Small, impossible miracles happening in a place built for the absolute, the irreversible, the final. They were like the treats of Halloween, little gifts of wonder. But in this context, they felt like tricks. They undermined the very foundation of the place, of Granger's world. Justice was supposed to be blind and final. Death was supposed to be the end. Douglas made a mockery of both. "The night has a different taste to it," Douglas said, not looking at Granger, but at the small, barred window high on his wall, through which a sliver of orange harvest moon was visible. "Can you feel it? The veil is thinning." "The veil?" Granger asked, his voice a whisper. "Between here and there, between then and now. It's why the children wear masks. It's not to hide from the living. It's to blend in with the things that walk tonight, the things that are allowed to walk." Douglas turned his head, and his eyes, in the dim light, seemed to hold the same soft, self-contained glow as the little flames. "This place is a thinning of its own kind, Mr. Granger." a place where the living and the dead keep company. On Halloween, the walls here will be like tissue paper. Granger felt a cold that had nothing to do with the October air trace its way down his spine. He thought of the world outside, of his own small house on the edge of town. His wife would have finished carving the pumpkin, its jagged smile, a familiar, friendly monster on the porch. The bowl of candy corn and Mary Jane's would be sitting by the door, ready for the little ghosts and goblins. It was a ritual of innocence, of play, but listening to Douglas, it felt like they were all just children playing with fire, unaware of the true conflagration that waited in the dark. The days leading to the 31st were a slow accumulation of dread, a countdown measured in the deepening silence of the cell block. The other inmates had stopped their nightly cacophony. They were quiet, watchful, like animals before a storm. They looked to cell 13 not with hope, but with a kind of dreadful reverence. Even Elliot was affected. His cruelty became more brittle, his steps more hesitant. He took to carrying a small, cloth-wrapped bundle, which he would unwrap and stare at during his breaks. Granger caught a glimpse of it once. It was a vintage Halloween noisemaker, a cardboard skull with a clacker inside. Elliot would hold it, his thumb tracing the leering, printed face, his own face a mask of conflicted emotion. The warden, Curtis, a man burdened by the weight of the finality he administered, came down to the block more frequently. He would stand outside Douglas' cell for long minutes, saying nothing, his shoulders slumped. He looked like a man waiting for a diagnosis. On the afternoon of the 30th, the tension broke. Franklin, in cell 5, a man who had killed 3 people in a robbery and shown no remorse, began to scream. It was not a scream of fear or rage, but of pure, unadulterated horror. He was clawing at his own face, his eyes wide, fixed on something only he could see in the corner of his cell. "The corn, the goddamned corn," he shrieked. "It has moving. It has got my legs." Granger and Elliot rushed to the cell. There was nothing there, just Franklin, alone, tearing bloody furrows in his own cheeks. "Get a hold of yourself, man." Elliot barked, unlocking the cell door, but Franklin wasn't listening. He was fighting an invisible foe, his body thrashing. The scarecrow, its eyes are looking at me. From down the row, Douglas' calm voice cut through the hysteria. He is remembering the field, the one where he left the boy. The corn remembers. On this night, everything remembers. Franklin screams dissolved into wet, choking gurgles. He was on the floor, his body convulsing as if held underwater. The smell of stagnant pond water and rotting vegetation filled the cell block, overpowering even Douglas' autumnal scent. Franklin thrashing slowed, then stopped. When they rolled him over, his face was frozen in a rictus of terror, his tongue swollen, his skin cold and clammy. There was no water on him, but his hair was streaked with pondweed, and his pockets were full of dried, yellow corn husks. Elliot backed away, his face pale. He looked from Franklin corpse to into Douglas' cell, his hand clutching the noisemaker in his pocket. "Witchcraft," he whispered. "It's devil's work." That night, Halloween night, the prison was a tomb within a world of celebration. Granger could hear, faintly, the distant, tinny sound of a radio from the guards' break room, playing a comedy program punctuated by spooky sound effects and laughter. The contrast was obscene. Inside the block, the silence was absolute and heavy, a physical weight. The single bulb in the corridor chose that night to die, plunging them into a darkness broken only by the sliver of moon through the high windows. Elliot lit a kerosene lantern, its flame a jumpy, nervous thing that made the shadows leap and caper like demons. The countdown to midnight was a drumbeat in Granger's soul. He thought of the traditions playing out in the free world. The children, transformed by costumes, moving through the twilight streets, their laughter sharp and bright. The ritual of trick-or-treat, the exchange of sweetness for a momentary fright. The jack-o'-lanterns with their fiery grins, warding off ancient spirits. Here, there was no warding. Here, they were inviting it in. As the clock tower in the town square began to chime 11, Douglas spoke from his dark cell. "It is time." His voice was different. It was no longer the voice of a single man, but a chorus, layered with whispers, with the rustle of dry leaves, with the sigh of a cold wind through bare branches. Elliot fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking. "Time for what? Time for you to burn. Is that it?" His voice was shrill, cracking with fear. "Time for the reaping," the Douglas voice replied. The iron door to cell 13 swung open of its own accord, the lock snapping with a sound like a breaking bone. Douglas stood in the doorway. He was not just a man anymore. His form seemed to shift and flow in the lantern light. For a moment, he was a stooped old man with a hollowed pumpkin for a head, a single candle flickering within. Then he was a tall, gaunt figure in a black robe, his face a pale smudge. Then he was a child in a cheap skeleton costume, the skull mask seeming to be his actual flesh. He was the spirit of the night itself, the ancient thing that Halloween had always been a mask for. He walked out into the corridor. Elliot, with a cry that was half sob, half battle yell, raised his billy club. Douglas simply looked at him. Elliot's club began to change. The wood twisted, sprouting leaves, and thorny vines that curled around his arm, biting deep. The cloth-wrapped noisemaker fell from his pocket and clattered on the stone floor. The cardboard skull snapped open, and from it poured not a sound, but a swarm of black, buzzing insects that clouded around Elliot's head. He screamed, batting at them, as they stung and bit, their forms shifting between flies and tiny, shrieking faces. Douglas passed him by and walked down the row of cells. He did not open the doors. He simply passed them, and as he did, the men inside changed. In cell 2, Miller, the forger, began to shrink, his skin hardening, his limbs contorting, until he was nothing but a small, gnarled figure made of root and bark, a terrified face peering from the knot of a tree. In cell 8, Henderson, the arsonist, burst into silent, cold flames that gave off no heat, his body turning to translucent, blue-tinged ice within the fire. In cell 10, Carter, the poisoner, dissolved into a thick, sweet-smelling syrup that pooled on the floor of his cell, reflecting the lamplight with a sickly, caramel sheen. He was harvesting them, not their lives, but their essences, their sins, turning them into the stuff of folklore and nightmare, into the raw material of the stories told around fires on nights like this. Granger could only watch, paralyzed, his mind refusing to accept the evidence of his eyes. This was not a miracle. This was a revelation. This was the world with its Halloween mask ripped off, showing the true, grinning skull beneath the holiday's playful paint. Douglas reached the end of the row and stood before Granger. The shifting forms settled, and he was just Douglas again, the quiet man with the peaceful eyes. But the eyes now held universes in their depths, an endless, cycling procession of autumns, of deaths, of Halloweens. You have shown compassion in a house without it, Mr. Granger, the chorus voice said, gentle now. You have looked upon the strange and not sought to break it. The night rewards such things. He reached out, and in his palm was not a flame, but a single piece of candy. It was a caramel apple, perfectly formed, its candy shell a deep, bloody red. The stick, a simple piece of clean, white wood. A treat, Douglas said, for when you go home, for the children. Then he turned and walked towards the heavy, iron door that led out of the cell block. It did not open. He simply passed through it, his form dissolving into a swirl of dry oak leaves and a puff of wood smoke-scented air. The lantern flame guttered and died, plunging the block into a darkness that was absolute and silent. The silence was broken by Elliot's whimpers. He was curled on the floor, his face a mass of welts, clutching his vine-scarred arm. Dawn found the prison in chaos. The warden was there, his face ashen, trying to make sense of the impossible. An inmate was dead of a parent, drowning on dry land. Another was a twisted piece of petrified wood. A third was a puddle of sticky syrup. A fourth was a frozen statue of ash. And Douglas was gone, vanished from a locked cell. Elliot was taken to the infirmary, babbling about witches and living corn. Granger told his story, haltingly, knowing how it sounded. The warden listened, his eyes old and tired, and did not dismiss it. He just nodded slowly, as if confirming a long-held, terrible suspicion. Granger was sent home. The world outside was washed in the clean, pale light of a November morning. The streets were littered with the detritus of the night's festivities, torn streamers, crushed candy wrappers, a discarded clown mask staring blankly at the gray sky. On his own porch, the jack-o'-lantern his wife had carved had collapsed in on itself, a blackened, rotten ruin, its cheerful grin now a sagging, grotesque scream. He walked inside. His wife was asleep. The house was quiet. On the kitchen table, the big wooden bowl for candy was empty save for a few stray pieces of licorice and a handful of candy corn. He stood there for a long time, the events of the night a screaming vortex in his mind. He reached into his pocket, his fingers closing around the cool, smooth surface of the caramel apple Douglas had given him. He took it out. It was perfect, unblemished. The red coating shone in the morning light like a hard candy jewel. He could almost taste it, the sweet crack of the shell, the tart burst of the apple beneath. A treat, a reward for his compassion. He thought of the transformations in the cell block. He thought of Franklin, choking on phantom water. He thought of Elliot, his arm twisted by thorny vines. He thought of Douglas, the coarse voice, the reaper in the dark. He looked at the apple. It was just a piece of candy, a harmless bit of Halloween fun. He lifted it, his hand trembling. He could throw it away, bury it in the trash with the other remnants of the night. He could pretend it was just a piece of candy, but he knew it wasn't. It was a symbol. Of what, he could not say. A gift, a warning, a communion, the embodiment of a mercy he did not understand, or a poison so subtle it would change him from the inside out. It was the entire, terrible, beautiful, monstrous mystery of the previous night, condensed into a single, perfect, red-glazed object. He stood there, in the quiet kitchen of a world that had already moved on from its night of frights, holding the indecipherable heart of the horror in his hand, and he knew, with a certainty that froze his soul, that he would never, ever be able to bring himself to eat it, and he would never, ever be able to throw it away. The apple sat on his kitchen counter for a week. He moved it from the counter to the top of the refrigerator, then to a high shelf in the pantry, trying to hide it from his own sight. But its presence was a constant, low hum in the back of his mind, a vibration that set his teeth on edge. His wife, Martha, noticed his distraction, the way his eyes would drift towards the pantry door during dinner. Is it the Franklin thing? She asked one night, her voice soft with concern. They were saying it was a heart attack. A strange one, but a heart attack all the same. Granger just nodded, pushing his food around his plate. A heart attack that filled a man's pockets with corn husks. He knew the official story was a fragile dam holding back an ocean of madness. The warden had signed off on it. Elliot was on extended leave, reportedly seeing specialists for a nervous condition. The other inmates, the ones who remained human, were transferred to other facilities, their files sealed. The state, it seemed, was eager to forget the entire block, but Granger could not forget. The memory of Douglas's voice, that layered chorus, was etched into his bones. The image of Miller turning to a gnarled root, his silent scream trapped in wood, was burned onto the back of his eyelids. He started taking the apple out when he was alone. He would place it on the kitchen table and just stare at it. It never changed. It never softened, never attracted a single fruit fly, never lost its impossible, glossy sheen. It was a fossil of that night, perfectly preserved. He found himself talking to it sometimes, low, muttered questions. What are you? What were you supposed to do? One afternoon, 2 weeks after Halloween, a small, sharp sound made him jump. He was in the kitchen, and the apple had rolled from its spot on the table to the very edge. It teetered for a moment, then fell to the linoleum floor. He winced, expecting a crack, a splatter. But there was only a solid, heavy thud, like a stone. He picked it up. It was unmarked. That night, he dreamed of a vast, silent orchard under a harvest moon. The trees were heavy with fruit, but the fruit was not apples. They were small, glowing faces, some peaceful, some twisted in agony. Douglas stood beneath one of the trees, his back to Granger. He was not a man, but a conduit, a hollow thing through which the wind of 1,000 years blew. He turned, and his face was the cardboard skull from Elliot S. Noisemaker, and he pointed a long, bony finger at Granger. He woke up gasping, the taste of cold soil in his mouth. The dream had felt more real than the waking world. He went to the kitchen. The apple was on the counter, right where he had left it. But now, in the pre-dawn gloom, he saw something new. A tiny, almost imperceptible flaw had appeared in the red candy shell. It was a hairline crack, no longer than a fingernail, and from it seeped a single, slow bead of liquid. It was not clear like water, or sticky like syrup. It was black, a black so deep it seemed to drink the light from the room. It hung there, a tiny, impossible tear. He knew then that the apple was not a static object. It was waiting. It was a seed, and it was beginning to germinate. The next day, he was called into the warden's office. Curtis looked worse than Granger had ever seen him. His suit was rumpled, his eyes bloodshot. Elliot S. dead, the warden said without preamble, his voice flat. They found him this morning, in his apartment. Granger felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. How? The official report will say an allergic reaction to the insect bites, complications from the plant matter in his arm. The warden leaned forward, his hands clasped so tightly the knuckles were white. But the coroner called me. Off the record. He said Elliot S. lungs were full of soil. Rich, loamy soil, like from a farm, and clutched in his hand. The warden trailed off, shaking his head. What was in his hand, sir? Corn, the warden whispered. A single, dried kernel of corn. The harvest. The reaping was not over. Elliot S. cruelty, his virulent hatred, had marked him. He had been part of the crop, and Douglas, or the force he served, had simply come back for the rest of him. Granger walked out of the prison gates that evening feeling the walls of his own life closing in. The apple was waiting for him. It was no longer just a reminder. It was a verdict. He was part of this now. His compassion had spared him the fate of the others, but it had tethered him to the mystery. He was the keeper of this impossible thing, and he understood, with a dawning, terrible clarity, that keepers have responsibilities. He drove home, but he did not go inside. He sat in his car, watching the house. Martha had turned on the lights, and the warm, yellow glow from the windows promised a normal life, a life of quiet dinners and television and forgetting. He looked at the pantry window, behind which the apple sat on its shelf. He thought of the black tear, the single bead of liquid darkness. He thought of Elliot, drowning in dirt. He could not bring this into his home any longer. He could not let this seed sprout near the woman he loved. The treat was a test, and failing the test, he suspected, would be a trick far worse than any he could imagine. He started the car. He did not know where he was going, only that he had to go. He had to find a place for the apple, a place where it belonged, or where it could do no harm. He drove away from the suburbs, towards the older, forgotten parts of the city, the streets growing darker, the trees bigger and more skeletal. The night air was cold, and it carried the scent of wood smoke and decaying leaves. The veil was gone, but a piece of it had been left behind, and it was sitting on the passenger seat beside him, glowing faintly in the dark. He found himself on a dirt track at the edge of the county, where the streetlights ended and the old woods began. The headlights cut a feeble path through the absolute dark, illuminating the trunks of leafless oaks that stood like a palisade. This was the place. He didn't know how he knew, but the knowledge was as certain as the weight of the apple in his coat pocket. It was an old place, a place that remembered. He killed the engine and stepped out into the cold. The silence was immense, broken only by the crunch of his shoes on frozen leaves. He walked until the road was a distant memory, guided by an instinct he did not question. He came to a clearing where the moon, nearly full, cast a sickly silver light. In the center stood the blackened, skeletal remains of a massive bonfire, a pyramid of charred logs and ash from some long-past celebration. This was where they would have come. The teenagers, the thrill-seekers, the ones who felt the old pull of the night and answered it with fire and noise. It was a place of modern ritual, built upon something much older. He took the apple from his pocket. It felt warmer now, almost alive, with a subtle, internal heat. The tiny crack had widened slightly, and the bead of black fluid had grown, a perfect, dark jewel clinging to the red shell. He knew what he had to do. This was not disposal. This was an offering, a return. He knelt in the cold dirt before the ashes of the fire. He placed the apple carefully on a flat stone that seemed to be a natural altar at the base of the pyre. As soon as it left his fingers, a profound relief washed over him. So powerful his knees buckled, and he had to brace himself with his hands. The constant, psychic hum that had plagued him for weeks ceased. The air was still and silent. For a long moment, nothing happened. The apple just sat there, a spot of garish, manufactured color in the monochrome night. Then the bead of black fluid trembled and fell. It hit the stone with a sound like a heavy drop of rain, and instead of soaking in, it spread. It flowed across the stone in a complex, branching pattern, like a vein of black lightning or the roots of a tree, impossibly fast. The pattern reached the base of the bonfire and vanished into the ash. A wind kicked up, sighing through the bare branches, carrying the scent of cold stone and something else, something sweet and cloying like overripe fruit. From the center of the ash pile, a single green shoot emerged. It grew with unnatural speed, twisting upward, thickening, its leaves unfurling broad and waxy in the moonlight. It was not an apple tree. It was a corn stalk, tall and sturdy. At its top, a single tassel shook in the wind, shedding a pollen that looked like gold dust. And from the side of the stalk, a single ear of corn swelled into being, its husk a pale, yellowish white. As Granger watched, the husks peeled back of their own accord slowly, like a flower blooming in a time-lapse film. There was no corn inside. Nestled within the soft, white silk was a face. It was small, no larger than his fist, and perfectly formed. It was the face of a young boy, his features peaceful in sleep. Granger recognized him from the old missing person posters that had haunted the town for a season. The boy from Franklin's Field. The boy's eyes opened. They were not human eyes. They were deep and brown, with the complex, hexagonal pattern of an insect's eyes, and they held a wisdom that was ancient and utterly alien. They looked at Granger through him and past him all at once. A voice spoke, not from the boy, but from the air itself, from the rustling leaves and the groaning trees. It was the same chorus voice he had heard from Douglas, but now it was fainter, more distant, as if speaking from across a great divide. The soil is fed. The cycle continues. The keeper has done his duty. The corn stalk began to wither, its green vitality leaching away in seconds, turning brown and brittle. The boy's face softened, the features dissolving back into the silk, which itself crumbled into dust. The entire stalk collapsed into a small, dry heap, indistinguishable from the rest of the ash. The apple was gone. The stone was bare. Granger stood up, his body aching, his mind a blank slate. He walked back to his car through the quiet woods. He did not look back. When he arrived home, the house was still and dark. He crept into bed beside his sleeping wife, the chill of the night still on his skin. The next morning, over coffee, Martha said, "You seem different, more settled." He just nodded and sipped his coffee. The memory of the clearing was already taking on the quality of a dream, vivid but insubstantial. He knew he would never speak of it. He had been a keeper, and now his task was done. He looked out the window at the bright, ordinary morning. The world had moved on, and so must he. But as he turned his head, a flicker of movement caught his eye. A single dead oak leaf, brown and curled, was caught in the bristles of the welcome mat on their porch. It hadn't been there when he came home. He knew, with a calm and final certainty, that it was a thank you note, and a reminder that next autumn, when the veil grew thin, he would be waiting, not as a prisoner, but as a warden of a different sort. The leaf was the only evidence, a brittle brown scrap that held the entire weight of the previous night. He left it there for a week, watching it through the window each morning. The wind tugged at it, rain tried to wash it away, but it remained, stubbornly anchored in the mat's fibers. It was a covenant. Finally, on a calm day, he went out and carefully picked it up. It did not crumble in his hand as he expected. It was dry and tough as leather. He took it to the garage and placed it in an old metal toolbox on a high shelf, next to a tarnished silver locket that had belonged to his mother. It was a reliquary now. Life resumed its mundane rhythm. He went back to work at the prison, but the warden had him reassigned to the front gate, processing visitors and deliveries. The new cell block was still under review, its future uncertain. Curtis never spoke of that night again, but a new understanding passed between them, a silent acknowledgement in a shared glance. They were both keepers of a terrible secret, curators of a truth that would dismantle the world if it were ever put on display. Months turned. The shock of the events faded for everyone else, becoming just another strange, unsolved story, a piece of local folklore. But for Granger, the memory did not fade, it settled. It became a part of his foundation. He found he could no longer watch the news with the same detached horror. He saw the patterns. A politician, venomous and cruel, was found dead in his study. A single, perfect black rose blooming from his heart. A corporate executive who had poisoned a river vanished from his locked penthouse. His bathwater found to be teeming with fat, healthy trout. The world had its own immune system, and it was not kind. He started taking long walks in the evening, not away from the old woods, but along their edges. He felt a pull, not of fear, but of guardianship. He picked up litter. He watched. One evening, close to the summer solstice, he saw a group of teenagers heading towards the clearing with backpacks full of beer. A normal, foolish summer ritual. But as he watched them go, a cold dread seized him. They were not meant for that place. Not tonight. He followed at a distance, his heart a dull drum in his chest. The bonfire site was as he remembered. The weeds had begun to sprout through the ash. The kids were loud, laughing, already cracking open their cans. One of them, a lanky boy with a defiant glint in his eye, kicked at the central ash pile. "Hey, check it out," he said, bending down. He pulled something from the soot. It was a long, white object, slender and smooth. A bone, a human finger bone. The boy laughed, a nervous, bravado-filled sound, and waved it at his friends. A relic. Granger stepped into the clearing. "You should put that down," he said, his voice low, but carrying an unexpected authority. The teenagers jumped, turning to face him. They saw a middle-aged man in a simple jacket, but something in his stillness, in the absolute certainty in his eyes, gave them pause. "It's just a bone, old man," the lanky boy said, but his voice wavered. "It doesn't belong to you," Granger said. He didn't move, didn't threaten. He simply was. "This place doesn't belong to you. Not tonight. Leave the bone. Leave the beer. Go home." The silence that followed was heavier than the night air. The bravado drained from the lanky boy's face. He looked at the bone in his hand, then at the dark trees surrounding them, as if seeing them for the first time. He dropped it as if it had burned him. It landed back in the ash with a soft thud. Without another word, the group gathered their things and hurried out of the clearing, not looking back. Granger waited until the sound of their retreat faded. He walked to the center and looked down at the bone. It was already being reclaimed by the ash, as if the ground itself was swallowing it back. He had not intervened as a man, but as a warden. He had enforced a boundary he alone understood. He walked home under the rising moon, a quiet sense of purpose warming him against the cool air. He was no longer just a guard. He was a sentinel at the edge of things. The autumn would come again, with its chill and its dying light, and he would be ready. The world had its monsters, but it also had its keepers. And he knew, with a profound and peaceful finality, which one he was. The following autumn, the air turned crisp, and the light took on that particular golden slant that made the world feel thin and nostalgic. Granger felt the change not in the weather, but in his bones, a subtle tuning of his spirit to an older frequency. He found himself spending more time in the garage, his eyes drifting to the metal toolbox on the high shelf. He never opened it, but he knew the leaf was there, a silent metronome counting down to the equinox. Martha noticed his quiet vigilance. She would find him staring out the kitchen window at the back field, his coffee growing cold. "You're waiting for something," she said one evening, not as an accusation, but a simple observation. He looked at her, this woman who shared his life, but not his secret, and felt a surge of protective love, so fierce it ached. "Just the turn of the season," he replied, and it was not quite a lie. The night it happened was October 29th. A hard rain had fallen, washing the world clean, but the wind had picked up, howling around the corners of the house. Granger was in his study, reading a book he would not remember, when a sound cut through the storm's roar. It was not the wind. It was a voice, thin and reedy, carried on the air from a great distance. It was a single word, his name, stretched into a long, mournful call. He stood, his book falling to the floor. He knew that voice. It was the chorus, but it was weak, strained. It was a call for help. He did not hesitate. He pulled on his coat and went to the garage. This time, he did not take the car. He took the old hurricane lantern from the workbench, lit it, and stepped out into the lashing rain. He walked, the lantern casting a wobbling globe of light against the oppressive dark, straight for the woods. The path was a river of mud, the trees whipping overhead. He pushed on, driven by a compulsion he no longer fought. When he broke into the clearing, the scene was wrong. The bonfire ashes had been washed into a gray smear. The stone altar was cracked clean down the middle, and in the center of the clearing stood a figure. It was Douglas, or what was left of him. He was translucent, like smoke held together by memory and rain. His form flickered, his features shifting between the man he had been and the cardboard skull he had worn. He was hunched over, as if holding a great weight. Through his ghostly chest, Granger could see the gnarled root that had been Miller, and it was pulsing with a sickly, greenish light. "The barrier is thin," the chorus voice whispered, emanating from the spectral form. "But the soil is weak here. The offering is spent. A new anchor is needed, a willing one." Douglas raised a shimmering hand and pointed at the cracked stone. They are trying to come through. The hungry ones. The old ones who were never meant to wear flesh. Granger understood. The apple had been a plug, a seal on a door. His act of returning it had reinforced that seal, but it was a temporary measure. The natural balance was off. The world was forgetting the old ways, the respect, the fear. The void was pressing in. "I am not a sacrifice," Granger said, his voice steady despite the cold terror coiling in his gut. "No," the chorus agreed, its voice fading in and out. "You are a gatekeeper. Your will is the lock. Your memory is the key. You must make an offering of remembrance. Speak the names." Douglas S. form flickered violently. "They are at the door." Granger stepped forward, the rain soaking him to the skin. He stood over the cracked stone, the lantern held high. He closed his eyes, pushing past his fear, and reached for the memories he had tried to bury. He saw Miller S.'s wooden face, forever screaming. He saw Elliot, his lungs packed with earth. He saw the boy in the corn, with his ancient insect eyes. He did not speak their names aloud. Instead, he focused on them, holding their images in his mind with a clarity and intensity he had never dared. He remembered them not as monsters or victims, but as part of the story, threads in the tapestry of that terrible night. He acknowledged their roles, their fates, their place in the cycle. As he did, the lantern flame, which had been guttering in the wind, suddenly burned still and bright, its light turning a deep, unwavering gold. The light fell upon the cracked stone, and for a moment, the two halves seemed to knit themselves back together. The pulsing, sickly light within the ghostly Miller root dimmed and went out. Douglas S. form solidified for a single, peaceful second. He looked at Granger, and for the first time, his eyes were his own tired, human, and grateful. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. Then he was gone. The wind died down to a whisper. The rain became a gentle drizzle. The clearing was just a clearing again, quiet and dark, save for the circle of golden light from Granger's lantern. He stood there for a long time, breathing in the clean, wet air. The pressure was gone. The call had been answered. He had not fought a monster or made a sacrifice. He had borne witness. He had remembered. That was his duty. That was the nature of his keeping. He walked home, the lantern light a tiny sun in the aftermath of the storm. He knew this would not be the last time. There would always be cracks, always be hungry things at the edge of sight. But he was there. He was the warden, the sentinel, the keeper of the threshold. And for now, for this turning of the year, the balance was restored. He found he could sleep deeply again, the kind of sleep that repairs the soul. The next morning, he fixed the loose hinge on the garden gate and repainted the porch swing for Martha. The work was simple, his hands steady. He was planting his own roots, firm and deep in the ordinary world, so he would be strong enough for the other. Weeks later, a package arrived at the prison, addressed to him personally. It was a heavy, flat rectangle wrapped in plain brown paper. There was no return address. Inside was a book, bound in worn, dark green leather. The pages were thick, handmade, filled with elegant, handwritten script and intricate drawings of plants, trees, and symbols he did not recognize. It was a journal. He flipped to the first page. The inscription read, "For the keeper of the crossroads. May this guide your watch." It was from Douglas, or what Douglas had become. The entries spoke of cycles, of signs to observe, of the subtle ways the other world bled into this one. It was not a book of magic, but a manual of observation. It spoke of listening to the birds for warnings, of reading the patterns of fungus on tree bark, of the meaning behind unseasonal frosts. It was a warden's log, passed from one hand to the next. He began reading it each night, not as a student studying for a test, but as a man learning the contours of his own land. He learned that the thing that had used Miller as its vessel was an echo of a hungry year, a fragment of a forgotten famine given form. He learned that the boy in the corn was a seed soul, a recycled life placed where the soil of reality was thin to help bind it. The world was far more strange and interconnected than he had ever imagined. One evening in early December, he was reading by the fireplace when Martha came and sat beside him. She looked at the old book in his lap, then at his face. "That's new," she said softly. He closed the book, his hand resting on the cover. He had carried his secret alone to protect her, but he saw now that the silence was its own kind of wall, and walls could be breached by things far worse than truth. "Yes," he said, "it's a history of the area, of the old stories." He took a breath, the deepest he had taken in years. "There are things I need to tell you, Martha, about the prison, about the woods, about me." He spoke through the night. He did not tell her everything. Some horrors were too sharp to share, but he told her enough. He told her about the wrongness in the new wing, about Douglas and the apple, about the clearing and his role. He told her he was a warden. She listened without interruption, her face pale but her eyes clear. When he finished, the fire had burned down to embers. She was silent for a long time, and he feared he had broken their world. Finally, she reached out and placed her hand over his on the book's cover. Her hand was warm. "I always knew there was a weight on you," she whispered. "I'm glad it's a purpose now, and not just a burden." She looked toward the window, at the dark shape of the woods against the night sky. "This is our home. We'll protect it together." And in that moment, with her hand on his, Granger felt the final piece of the old, frightened man within him settle into peace. He was not alone on the threshold. The light in the window was not just a beacon for him, but for them. The balance was not just his to keep, but theirs to share. The winter would be long, but for the first time, he looked forward to the spring. The spring came, not with a sudden burst, but as a slow, green unfurling. Granger found himself seeing the world through the lens of the green book. He noticed how the crows gathered on the fence posts before a storm, their calls a specific, guttural warning. He saw the way the lichen grew thicker on the north side of the old oaks, pointing toward the places where the air sometimes hummed with a silent energy. Martha, now a partner in his quiet vigil, learned with him. She had a gardener's eye for detail, and she began pointing out things he had missed: a patch of mushrooms that formed a perfect, unbroken circle behind the shed, a fox that would appear at the edge of the tree line every full moon and watch the house, its eyes like chips of amber. Their life took on a new, gentle rhythm. The secret was no longer a stone in his pocket, but a shared hearth between them. He continued his work at the prison gate, but the job felt distant, like a play he was watching from the back row. His real work began when he came home, when he and Martha would walk their land, noting the small, strange signs. It was on one of these walks, in late April, that they found the first stone. It was nestled at the base of the oldest oak on their property, a smooth, gray river rock that was unnaturally warm to the touch. Carved into its surface was a symbol from the book, 3 spirals connected at a central point. The book called it the mark of the crossroads. "He's checking in," Martha said, her voice soft with awe rather than fear. Granger nodded, pocketing the stone. It was a confirmation. The connection was not severed. Douglas, or the consciousness that had been Douglas, was still out there, a part of the cycle, and Granger was still the warden. A week later, a second stone appeared, this one by their well, marked with a single, wavy line representing water. That evening, a storm system the Weather Service had not predicted materialized and drenched their parcel of land, ending a minor drought that had been threatening the early seedlings. They were not just being watched over, they were being communicated with. The world was speaking, and they were learning its language. The final stone came on the eve of May. It was placed squarely in the center of their porch, right where the dead leaf had been. This stone was black and cool, carved with a closed eye. The meaning was clear. The time of active signs was over. The veil was thickening with the growth of summer. The watch was now one of quiet observation. Granger placed the 3 stones on the mantelpiece, a small, silent altar to his duty. He knew this was only a respite. The equinoxes and solstices were the dangerous times, the moments of turning when the locks were tested. But for now, the world was lush and green, and the hidden things were content to sleep in the sun-dappled shadows. He sat on the porch swing with Martha, the gentle creak of the chains, a soothing melody. The fireflies were out, blinking their tiny lanterns in the dusk. He thought of the hungry things on the other side, of the fragile balance he upheld. But for this one peaceful evening, the only hunger he felt was for the simple apple pie Martha had baked, and the only balance that concerned him was the shared weight of the 2 of them on the swinging seat. The night was quiet, and for now, that was enough. The summer passed in a haze of heat, and the low, humming chorus of insects. Granger found a strange comfort in the monotony. He mended fences under the high sun, the smell of cut grass, and warm earth a tangible shield against the memory of colder, thinner air. The green book remained on the mantel, but he consulted it less, its lessons moving from his head into his bones. He knew the land now, its moods and whispers, in a way that felt older than thought. Martha was the one who noticed the new silence. It wasn't a peaceful quiet, but an absence. The crows had vanished from the fence posts. The fox no longer made its monthly appearance. The woods beyond their property line stood preternaturally still, as if holding a breath. On the morning of the autumn equinox, Granger woke knowing. The air in the bedroom was sharp and still. He dressed and went to the mantel, not for the book, but for the 3 stones. He picked up the black one with the closed eye. It was warm again, and when he held it to his ear, he fancied he could hear a faint, dry rustle, like old leaves skittering across stone. He didn't go to the woods that day. He felt no pull to the clearing. The threat, he understood now, was not always a singular breach in a single place. It was a tide, and it could rise anywhere the fabric was worn thin. His job was to reinforce the weave. He spent the day walking the perimeter of his land with Martha, a silent, shared patrol. They didn't speak of what they were doing, but their hands occasionally brushed, a brief, solid connection. They paused at the property's corners, and at each, Granger would take a moment to simply stand, to feel the ground under his feet, and impress upon it a sense of solidity, of belonging to the world of light and substance. As dusk began to bleed into the sky, a fine, cold mist rolled in from the woods, clinging to the trees and muffling sound. It was then that they saw the light. It was a flicker deep within the tree line on the northern border, a sickly, phosphorescent green that pulsed weakly against the gray fog. Martha's hand tightened on his arm. "It's not in the clearing," she whispered. "No," Granger said. "It's trying a different door." He led her back to the house, his heart calm. This was not a night for lanterns or for standing on cracked stones. This was a night for hearths. They went inside, and Granger locked the door, not because a lock would stop what was out there, but because it was a ritual, a statement of boundary. He built a fire in the fireplace, not a large, roaring blaze, but a small, steady, enduring one. He and Martha sat before it, and they began to talk. They spoke of ordinary things. They talked about repainting the kitchen, about the vegetable garden for next spring, about the novel Martha was reading. They spoke of their life, their shared history, filling the room with the weight and warmth of their memories, of birthday parties and quiet anniversaries, and the small, cumulative joys of a life built together. The green light in the woods pulsed once, brighter, and then died away completely. The mist began to lift. The pressure that had been building in the air simply vanished. Granger looked at Martha and saw the understanding in her eyes. They had not fought the darkness. They had not even faced it. They had simply made their home, their shared life, so real and so solid that the hungry thing at the edge found no purchase, no crack to slither through. Their love was not a weapon, it was a foundation. He added another log to the fire, and they sat together in the quiet glow, listening as the familiar sounds of the night an owl, the rustle of a possum in the leaves slowly returned. The balance was held, not by a single man, but by the world he had chosen to build and protect. And for the first time, Granger felt that this world was stronger than any shadow. Story 2. The first thing I noticed was the silence. It was the evening of October 28th, and we had just crossed the threshold of Blackfield House. But the sound that was missing, the one that should have been there, was the wind. All day it had been a constant, a low, moaning presence in the skeletal branches of the oaks lining the long drive, a force that sent spirals of crimson and bronze leaves dancing across the hood of our car. But here, inside the high stone walls of the estate, the air was perfectly, unnervingly still. It was a void you could feel, a pressure against the eardrums, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Justice, the heir to this crumbling legacy, took our coats with a sardonic smile that didn't reach his eyes. He was a man carved from the same granite as his home, all sharp angles and cold resilience. "Welcome," he said, his voice echoing in the cavernous foyer. "The wind doesn't reach in here. It never has. The house prefers its own sounds." Amos, our scholar, our leader, was already vibrating with a nervous energy, his fingers twitching as if itching to take notes. He was a man built of books and theories, his fascination with the paranormal a purely intellectual pursuit, or so he claimed. Fascinating, he breathed, his gaze sweeping over the dark wood paneling, the cobwebbed chandelier. A perfect acoustic anomaly, a pocket of stillness. Denise, ever the pragmatist, snorted softly. She was the independent one, the witty shield she used to deflect anything that smacked of the supernatural. Or it is just well insulated. This place is a tomb. Probably has the heating bills of one, too. But it was Leona who concerned me most. She stood just inside the door, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, her face pale as parchment. She was our sensitive, our fragile vessel. Her large eyes, usually so soft, were wide with a terror that was anything but theoretical. She wasn't looking at the architecture or the decor. She was staring at the empty space at the top of the grand staircase. "It is watching us," she whispered, so quietly I almost missed it. "It is so hungry." The house did feel alive. Not in a warm, welcoming way, but in the way a predator is alive, patient, calculating, and deeply aware of the prey that has just wandered into its territory. The flickering light from the massive fireplace seemed to pulse in time with some slow, subterranean heartbeat. The shadows in the corners of the room were too deep, too solid, and they clung to the edges of my vision long after I looked away. Justice led us to our rooms. Mine was at the end of a long, portrait-lined hall. The faces in the paintings were all his ancestors, their eyes seeming to track my progress, their dour expressions framed by fraying gold leaf. On the bedside table, someone had placed a small, clumsily carved jack-o'-lantern. Its grin was a twisted, lopsided sneer, and the candle inside had burned down to a puddle of wax. leaving the room smelling faintly of scorched pumpkin and wick smoke. It was a strange touch, this Halloween decoration in a place that seemed to exist outside of time. But then I remembered the date. The season was upon us, even here. That first night, the silence was broken. Not by the wind, but by a sound from below, a low, rhythmic scraping, like a heavy piece of furniture being dragged across a stone floor. It would start, continue for exactly 17 seconds, and then stop. A minute of perfect silence, then it would begin again. The scrape, the drag, the stop. The monotony of it was a form of torture, sanding down my nerves until they were raw. I lay in the antique bed, the mattress smelling of dust and dried lavender, and counted the repetitions until dawn tinged the sky a bruised purple. The next day, October 29th, the atmosphere outside the house was a stark contrast. The unnatural stillness within its walls was belied by the vibrant death throes of autumn. The grounds were a riot of color, a tapestry of fiery reds, burning oranges, and deep golds. But even this beauty felt sinister. The leaves, when they fell, did so without a sound, carpeting the earth in a muffling layer. The few pumpkins that grew wild in the overgrown kitchen garden were rotten. Their sides collapsed inwards, swarming with black flies. The smell of decay was a sweet, cloying perfume beneath the crisp air. We gathered in the library, a room dominated by a massive, unlit hearth and shelves of books bound in what looked like moldering skin. Amos was in his element, spreading out maps of the house and old diaries he convinced Justice to share. The history is complex, Amos began, his voice a reverent hush. The original Blackfield, Alistair Blackfield, was a reclusive man, deeply interested in older traditions. He built this house on a site of ancient significance, a place where the local folklore claimed the veil between worlds was tissue thin. He was particularly obsessed with Samhain, the Celtic precursor to our Halloween. He didn't see it as a night for candy and costumes. For him, it was a night for communion, for feeding. Feeding what? Denise asked, her tone lightly mocking, but I saw her hand tighten on the arm of her chair. The house, Leona said from her perch in the window seat. She was staring out at the gray sky, her reflection a ghost in the glass. It has always been hungry. It needs an offering. Every year, that's the tradition. Justice, who had been silently observing from a shadowed corner, stirred. My family has always been caretakers. We maintain the balance. The stories are just that stories to explain away bad harvests, lost livestock, the occasional missing traveler. But his voice lacked conviction. It was the hollow recitation of a line he'd been forced to learn. That afternoon, I found Leona in the grand hall, standing before the cold fireplace. She was tracing the intricate carvings on the mantelpiece with a trembling finger. The carvings depicted a harvest scene sides, sheaves of wheat, and more disturbingly, figures in procession, their faces hidden by crude masks, carrying something small and squirming towards a central, gaping mouth carved into the stone. "It has the same face," she murmured as I approached. "What face?" "The jack-o'-lantern in my room. The one in the painting at the top of the stairs. The one the children are carrying in this stone. It has the same twisted grin. It has his grin. Alistair S." A cold knot tightened in my stomach. I hadn't noticed it before, but now I saw it everywhere. The leering, lopsided smile was a motif throughout the house, hidden in the patterns of the wallpaper, the ironwork of the sconces, the grain of the wood floors. The house was infested with that grin. That night, the scraping returned. But this time, it was accompanied by another sound, faint at first, then growing clearer. It was the sound of children laughing, but it was wrong. It was too high, too shrill, devoid of any real joy. It was the sound of glass breaking, of mimicry. It echoed through the halls, mingling with the relentless scrape, drag, stop. I pulled the covers over my head, but the sounds were inside the room with me, inside my skull. The wind, I thought, desperately. Where is the wind? But there was only the silence, and the sounds the house made to fill it. October 30th, the day before Halloween. A palpable dread had settled over all of us, thick as the fog that now clung to the lower parts of the grounds. Denise S. wit had dried up, replaced by a nervous vigilance. Amos S. intellectual curiosity had curdled into a frantic, fearful scholarship. He barely looked up from the diaries, his lips moving soundlessly as he read. Justice had become a ghost in his own home, appearing and disappearing without a sound, his face a mask of grim resignation. And Leona was fading. She spent most of her time in her room, claiming the presence in the house was becoming unbearable, a constant pressure on her mind. It is showing me things, she told me when I brought her some tea. Her hands were ice cold. It is not just hungry. It is lonely. It wants a family. It wants us to stay. Forever. The house was no longer a passive observer. It was an active manipulator. I would walk into a room and see one of the portraits out of the corner of my eye. Its expression changed from a frown to that familiar, twisted grin. The small jack-o'-lantern in my room would be in a different position each time I returned. Its candle, though I never lit it, always a little shorter. The smell of the place had shifted, too. The dust and decay were now undercut by the cloying, sugary scent of rotting candy, of caramel apples left too long in the sun. That evening, we tried to have a semblance of a normal dinner in the vast, cold dining room. It was a failure. The conversation was stilted, punctuated by long, heavy silences. At one point, Denise dropped her fork. The clatter on the polished wood floor was shockingly loud. In the ringing silence that followed, we all heard it clearly from the floor above, the distinct, cheerful sound of a child skipping. We froze, our eyes locked. Then came the sound of a small, hard ball of marble, perhaps rolling slowly, deliberately, down the hallway above us. Tap, 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 it reached the top of the stairs and began its descent, one step at a time. Thump, thump, thump. It stopped outside the dining room door. No one moved. one breathed. The doorknob began to turn slowly, with a rusty squeal. Justice was the first to break. He slammed his fist on the table, making the silverware jump. Enough, he roared, his voice cracking. He stood up, his chair screeching backwards. This ends tomorrow. All Hallows Eve. The balance will be reset. It has to be. He stormed out, leaving the four of us in the candlelit room, the uneaten food congealing on our plates. The doorknob had gone still. The house was quiet again, but it was the silence of a cat that has just cornered a mouse. The night of the 30th was the worst yet. The scraping was faster, more frantic. The false laughter was a constant, maddening chorus. And beneath it all, a new sound, a wet, squelching, chewing noise, as if something large was feasting in the darkness just beyond my door. I didn't sleep. I sat in a chair by the window, watching the enormous orange harvest moon dip below the horizon, its sickly light finally extinguished. The house was awake, and it was hungry. Halloween. I awoke not to sunlight, but to a profound gray dimness. A thick, unnatural fog had descended, swallowing the grounds whole. The world beyond my window was a formless, shifting void. The house was preternaturally quiet, the night-esque cacophony replaced by a waiting, eager hush. We found Justice in the grand hall. He had built a fire in the massive hearth, and the flames cast long, dancing shadows that writhed up the walls like tormented spirits. He was dressed in a formal black suit that was too old-fashioned, too severe. In his hands, he held 5 small white masks. They were utterly plain, featureless, except for 2 eye holes. "It is time," he said, his voice flat and empty. "The veil is at its thinnest. The house requires its due. To maintain the balance, to protect the world outside from what dwells here." Amos shook his head, backing away. "This is madness, Justice. We were leaving." "You can tea," Justice said, and for the first time, I saw genuine emotion in his face, a bottomless, weary pity. "The doors want tea open. The paths are gone. The house has you. It always has from the moment you entered. It has been tasting you, learning your fears, your weaknesses. Now, it has time for the ritual." He held out the masks. "We wear these to hide ourselves from it, to become blank slates. It is the only way to survive the night. It is the only tradition that matters." Denise laughed, a harsh, broken sound. "You ray insane." But Leona stepped forward, her movements dreamlike, and took a mask. "Yes, right," she said, her voice distant. "It doesn't want to see our faces. It wants to see its own." She placed the blank mask over her face, and in the firelight, it was no longer blank. It seemed to shift, to form the contours of that now familiar, twisted grin. A deep, resonant thrumming began to emanate from the very stones of the house. The fire in the hearth flared, burning with an impossible, green-tinged light. The air grew thick and heavy, smelling of ozone, cold soil, and spoiled candy. One by one, driven by a terror that transcended reason, we took the masks. porcelain was cold and strangely soft against my skin. The world narrowed to the two small holes, the view fragmented and distant. Through them, I saw the hall change. The shadows congealed into solid forms. The carvings on the mantelpiece seemed to writhe and dance. The portraits on the walls were no longer of Justice's ancestors, but of leering, pumpkin-headed figures, their eyes glowing with embers. Justice began to chant, his voice a low monotone that matched the thrumming of the house. It was not in English, but in something older, guttural, a language of earth and blood and endings. From the soil we are taken, to the silence we are given. The harvest of fear is our sacrament. The grin in the dark is our truth. The house provides, the house consumes. The veil is thin, the offering is made. We were moving now, not of our own volition, but pulled by an invisible current. A procession of blank white masks. We filed out of the grand hall and into the fog-shrouded grounds. The fog parted for us, forming a path that led to the old, overgrown family plot. A small cemetery choked with weeds and tilted, moss-eaten headstones. In the center of the graveyard was a flat, black stone, an altar. And on that altar lay a single, massive pumpkin. It was uncarved, but pulsating with a faint, internal light, as if something alive and terrible was trapped within, beating to get out. Justice's chant grew louder, more insistent. The thrumming of the house became a deafening roar that vibrated in my bones. The fog around us began to solidify, to take shape. Figures emerged from the gray tall, slender, their heads misshapen lumps. They were the watchers, the ancient ones, drawn to the thinning of the veil. The mask stays on after midnight, Justice chanted. The face beneath is forfeit. He produced a long, ceremonial knife from his coat, its blade black and pitted. He turned not to the pumpkin, but to us. The offering was not the pumpkin. It never had been. Leona was the first. She didn't tease struggle as he led her to the altar. She lay upon the cold stone as if it were her own bed. The chants of the figures in the fog rose to a fever pitch. Justice raised the knife, and the house, the great, hungry maw of Blackfield, sighed with pleasure. I do not know what happened next. My mind, sheltered behind the blank white mask, shattered. There was a scream that was not a scream, a light that was the absence of all light, and a feeling of consummation, of ancient, ravenous hunger being, for a single moment, sated. When I awoke, I was in my bed. Sunlight, real and golden, streamed through the window. The fog was gone. The silence was gone, replaced by the cheerful chirping of birds. The door to my room stood open. I stumbled out, my body aching, my mind a hollowed-out shell. The grand hall was empty. The fire was dead. There was no sign of Justice, of Amos, of Denise. But in Leona's room, I found her. She was sitting before her mirror, brushing her hair. She turned and smiled at me. It was a warm, vibrant, loving smile. It was not her smile. "Good morning," she said, and her voice was Leona-esque. But the cadence, the light in her eyes, was that of something old and deeply satisfied. The house is so much quieter now, so much happier. I fled. I ran down the drive, the gravel crunching under my feet, a sound so normal it was blasphemous. I didn't look back. I knew what I would see. A single lit window in the upper floor, and in it, a face watching me go. A face that was Leona-esque, but wearing the twisted, lopsided grin of Alistair Blackfield. I live in a small apartment now, in a city that is never quiet. But every October, the silence finds me. When the leaves start to turn and the pumpkins appear on porches, I feel it. The hunger. The house is patient. It knows I am out here. It knows the veil will thin again. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear it. Not the wind, never the wind, but a low, rhythmic scraping from a place that is not my home. The scrape, the drag, the stop. And I know the ritual is not over. It has only just begun. The house provides. The house consumes. The veil is thin. The offering is made. The house provides. The house consumes. The veil is thin. The offering is made. The house provides. The house consumes. The veil is thin. The offering is forever. The words became a mantra in my head, a wheel that turned with the passing seasons. I tried medication. I tried therapy. I tried moving again to a place where the sun was relentless and the trees were evergreen. But the memory of Blackfield was not a memory. It was a stain, and it had seeped into the fabric of my reality. A year after my escape, on the eve of Halloween, a package arrived at my new address. It was a small, square box wrapped in plain brown paper. There was no return address. My hands shook as I cut the tape. Inside, nestled in yellowed tissue paper, was a small, clumsily carved jack-o'-lantern. Its grin was a twisted, lopsided sneer. It was identical to the one that had been in my room. I threw it in the trash, then retrieved it, my heart hammering. I took it to the dumpster behind my building, smashed it to pulp with a brick, and watched the garbage truck haul it away the next morning. I felt no relief. The act was meaningless. The sending of it was the point. A reminder, a receipt. The following October, it was a photograph. It showed the grand staircase at Blackfield, taken from below. The empty space at the top was no longer empty. A figure stood there, shrouded in shadow, but the shape of the head was wrong, lumpy, and elongated. It was mailed to my office. I changed my name. I changed my city. I got a job that required constant travel, thinking movement could be a shield. It was not. The house was not a location. It was a condition. On a business trip to a bland, Midwestern city, I checked into a chain hotel. The room was impersonal, beige, and safe. But that night, as I tried to sleep, the air grew cold. The scent of dust and dried lavender, then of scorched pumpkin, filled the room. I sat bolt upright, fumbling for the lamp. The digital clock on the nightstand was blinking, its numbers gone. In their place, was a single, repeating symbol, a lopsided smile. I do not sleep on Halloween anymore. I sit in a lighted room with the television on, trying to drown out the silence. But last year, the television failed. The screen went black, and from the speakers came a sound, faint at first, then unmistakable. The sound of a child skipping. Then, the rhythmic, grinding scrape of something heavy being dragged across a stone floor. It lasted for exactly 17 seconds. They are not trying to pull me back. They are simply letting me know that the distance between us is an illusion. The house is a seed that was planted in my soul, and it is growing in the dark, fertile soil of my fear. This morning, I found it on my kitchen counter. A small, white, featureless mask. I live alone. The doors were locked. I have not left my apartment in 3 days. The sun is setting now. The orange light of dusk looks like fire. I am holding the mask. It is cold and strangely soft, like old skin. The silence in my apartment is deepening, becoming a waiting, eager hush. It is almost time. The veil is thin. I can hear the faint, wet, chewing sound from the other side of my front door. It is so hungry, and I am so very tired of running. The mask is in my hands. It feels like an answer. The only tradition that matters. The house provides. The house consumes. The veil is thin. The offering is me. The porcelain was cold against my forehead, a shock that jolted a final, fleeting spark of resistance. I could throw it. I could smash the window and scream into the gathering dark. But the silence had already swallowed the thought. It was a heavy, woolen quiet, and it promised an end to the fear, an end to the running. It promised rest. My fingers moved of their own accord, tying the silk ribbons behind my head. The world narrowed to 2 small circles. The beige walls of my apartment through the eye holes seemed to waver, the color leaching away into shades of gray. The cheerful print of a generic cityscape blurred, its lines reforming into the familiar, grotesque carvings of Blackfield's Grand Hall. The scent of my own coffee, long gone cold, was now utterly overpowered by the cloying sweetness of rotting candy. The chewing sound from the hallway stopped. In its place came a new sound, one I remembered from the graveyard. A low, resonant thrumming that started in the floorboards and climbed the bones of my legs, settling deep in my chest. It was the house tuning itself. It was here. The doorknob to my apartment began to turn. It wasn't the frantic, squealing turn from Blackfield's dining room. This was smooth, assured, as if the lock had never existed. The door swung inward. The hallway outside was not my hallway. It was the long, dark corridor of Blackfield, the one that led to the grand staircase. The worn floral carpet was gone, replaced by cold, shadow-drenched stone. A figure stood at the far end, silhouetted by a green-tinged light I knew came from the great hearth. It was Justice, still in his formal black suit, his own featureless mask turned toward me. He did not gesture. He simply stood, waiting. I rose from my chair. My body felt light, disconnected. The terror was still there, a cold stone in my gut, but it was distant, someone else's problem. The mask did that. It separated the self from the fear. I took a step forward, then another. My shoes made no sound on the stone floor that had replaced my laminate. I passed my kitchen. Through the eye holes, I saw the altar stone from the graveyard where my small table should have been. The massive, pulsating pumpkin sat upon it, its skin straining, the light within beating like a diseased heart. Justice turned and began to walk. I followed. Our procession was silent. The thrumming was our music. We passed other doorways, other apartments, but their doors were now heavy, dark wood, closed and silent. From behind one, I heard a desperate, muffled sob. A normal person, a real person, hiding from the night. They were in their world. I was in mine. The veil was not just thin here, it was torn. We descended the staircase that was not my apartment. Building S, the air grew colder, thick with the smell of damp earth and ozone. The figures were there again, emerging from the walls themselves, their lumpen heads swaying, their presence a pressure that made the mask feel like a blessing. We did not go to the graveyard. We arrived in the grand hall. The fire roared with that impossible green flame, casting long, dancing shadows that were too solid, too intentional. Amos and Denise were there. They stood by the fire, their bodies rigid, their white masks pristine. They were waiting. They were part of the ritual now, forever. Their silence was absolute. Justice led me to the center of the room, before the hearth. The carvings on the mantelpiece were alive, the stone figures processing toward the gaping mouth. They're tiny, squirming, offering now clearly a miniature, writhing human form. He did not speak. He didn't need to. The house spoke for him. It was a voice in my mind, not of words, but of intent, of ancient, simple need. It was time to complete the circle. The runaway was home. The balance would be restored. He raised the black, pitted knife. I did not close my eyes. Behind the mask, I watched the flames. I thought of Leona's smile, the one that was not hers. I thought of the quiet, the profound, endless quiet of being part of something greater than fear. The knife did not strike me. Instead, Justice turned the blade and pressed the hilt into my gloved hand. My fingers curled around it. The metal was warm, almost alive. The understanding came not as a thought, but as a memory I had never lived. The caretaker was tired. His line was thin, his will eroded by centuries of bearing the burden. The house needed a new anchor, a new soul to tie it to this world, to manage the hunger, to conduct the ritual. The offering was not always a death. Sometimes it was a succession. Justice took a step back, his head bowing. The thrumming of the house focused on me, a vibration of acceptance, of ownership. The blank white mask on my face felt different now. It was no longer a shield. It was a crown. Through the eye holes, I looked at the terrified, frozen forms of Amos and Denise. I looked at the leering portraits on the walls. I looked at the hungry, gaping mouth in the stone. The house provides. The house consumes. The veil is thin. The caretaker is home. The knife felt like an extension of my own bone, a heavy, certain weight. The thrumming of the house was no longer an external sound, but the beat of my own new heart. I looked from Amos to Denise, their masked faces turned toward me, their bodies trembling with a fear I could now taste on the air, a sweet, metallic flavor. They were the sustenance. They were the tradition. Justice, his purpose fulfilled, took another step back, merging with the deepest shadows near the hearth. He was fading, his duty passing to me. I could feel the house pouring its knowledge into me, a cold, dark river of history and hunger. I saw all the Halloweens that had come before, the processions, the altars, the moments of consummation. I saw the long line of caretakers, their faces grim and resigned, until they weren't. Until they wore the grin, too. My free hand rose to my mask. The porcelain was warm now, pulsing in time with the pumpkin on the altar. My fingers traced the smooth, featureless surface, and beneath them, I felt a change. A subtle grooving, a contour forming. The mask was no longer blank. It was taking its shape, my shape, the face of the new master of Blackfield. A voice that was both mine and not mine. A dry rustle of dead leaves and old bones issued from behind the transforming mask. The house is hungry, it said. Amos made a small, choked sound and stumbled backward. Denise stood her ground, a statue of terror. I took a step toward them, the black knife held loosely at my side. The shadows in the room leaned in, eager. But then the house showed me something else, the final piece of the inheritance. The ritual was not just about feeding. It was about preservation. The souls were not consumed utterly, they were stored. Their terror of vintage the house sipped from for decades. Their identities slowly eroded until nothing was left but a hollow echo, a puppet for the house's joy. Leona was not gone. She was a vessel, and she was happy. They were all happy here in the end. The fear was just the seasoning. This understanding settled upon me, a mantle of terrible peace. The running was over. The fear was over. I was not a victim. I was a curator. I lowered the knife. This was not their time. The house had its new anchor. The balance was already shifting. They would remain, of course, guests, part of the family. I gestured with the blade, a casual flick of my wrist toward the hallway. "Go to your rooms," the rustling voice commanded. "The night is not for you. It is for us." They fled, their footsteps echoing in the sudden, profound silence. I was alone in the grand hall, the new caretaker. I turned to the fire, watching the green flames dance. I could feel every room, every board, every stone of the house. I could feel the slow, contented beat of the pumpkin in the graveyard. I could feel the watchers in the fog, settling back into their slumber, satisfied for now. I raised a hand, and the front door of Blackfield, miles and worlds away from my old apartment, swung open with a groan. Outside, the real world was dark and quiet. Somewhere out there, Others were laughing, telling scary stories, their fears a fleeting game. I smiled behind my mask. I could feel its new, permanent shape now, the lopsided grin carved not into pumpkin, but into my very soul. The house was patient. The house was hungry. And I was now its will. The veil would thin again, and I would be waiting. The silence in the hall was complete, a living thing that I now commanded. I walked to the front door and pushed it shut, the heavy oak ceiling with a final, resonant thud that locked out the world. The lock was not a physical one, but a thing of will. My will. I ascended the grand staircase, my footsteps silent on the cold stone. The portraits watched me pass, their eyes no longer malevolent, but respectful. I was one of them now, more than them. I reached the door to the Master S chamber, the room that had been Alistair S. Then Justice S. The door swung open before I touched it. The room was Spartan, containing only a large, canopied bed draped in black velvet, and a single, high-backed chair facing the window that overlooked the ruined graveyard. On a small, onyx table beside the chair sat a stack of old, leather-bound journals, the caretaker S logs. I did not need to read them to know their contents. The knowledge was in me, the memories of 100 Halloweens, 1,000 offerings. But the physical act felt right, a ritual in itself. I sat in the chair and opened the top journal. The handwriting changed every few decades, but the words were always the same. Accounts of the thinning veil, the names of the guests, the name of the chosen. The last entry in Justice S. Precise, spidery script was brief. The runaway has returned. The line continues. The house is satisfied. I dipped a quill that lay beside the journal into an inkwell of tarnished silver. On a fresh page, I began to write. My handwriting was different. It was stronger, darker, with a sharp, angular slant. The new caretaker is home, I wrote. The house is hungry. Next season, we will feast. As I wrote, I felt a presence solidify beside me. I did not need to look. I knew the feel of her, the particular hollow resonance that was Leona, or what wore her. She stood by the window, her hands clasped demurely in front of her. The vibrant, stolen smile was gone, replaced by a look of serene emptiness. She was a well that had been drunk dry. The others are unsettled, she said, her voice a soft echo in the quiet room. Let them be, I replied, my voice still that unsettling rustle. Unsettlement is a precursor to acceptance. They will learn their roles. She nodded, her gaze fixed on the graveyard below. He is waiting for you, in the garden. I knew who she meant. I closed the journal and stood. The house shifted around me, a corridor rearranging itself to provide a more direct path. I walked through the ever-changing halls, past closed doors behind which I could feel the cowering presences of Amos and Denise. Their fear was a faint, sweet perfume. I found him standing by the black altar stone. The massive pumpkin was gone, its purpose fulfilled for another year. Justice stood with his back to me, his hands clasped behind him. He had removed his mask. I could see the nape of his neck, pale and thin, the skin stretched tight over the vertebrae. "It is a heavier crown than it appears," he said, without turning. "It is no crown," I answered. "It is a symbiosis." He finally turned to face me. His face was shockingly ordinary, lined with weariness and a profound, entrenched sorrow. He looked like a retired accountant, not the master of a hungry god. "I have served for 60 years. I have forgotten the face of the sun. You may go," I said. "The house releases you." A flicker of something hope, terror crossed his features. "Go where?" "Wherever you wish. The house will provide a path, but you will forget. All of it. You will wake tomorrow in a bed you do not recognize, with a life you do not remember, believing you have always been there." He absorbed this, his shoulders slumping with a relief so total it looked like collapse. "And you are prepared for this." I looked past him, at the eaten headstones, at the dark soil that was richer and darker than any soil had a right to be. I could feel the roots of the house deep beneath my feet, tangled with bones and old, rusted secrets. I could feel its desire as my own. "I am not prepared," I said, the rustle in my voice giving way to something colder, harder. "I am willing." He nodded, a silent transfer of power. He walked past me, toward the edge of the graveyard, where the fog was already gathering, not to hold him in, but to guide him out. I did not watch him leave. I looked down at the altar stone. A single, perfect pumpkin vine was already breaking through the soil at its base, a tiny, furled green tendril seeking the moon. Next year, S. heart was already beginning to grow. The house settled around me, its hunger momentarily abated, its new master a perfect fit for its ancient, desolate soul. I was home, and I was so very, very hungry. The days began to blend, not into one another, but into the perpetual twilight of the house. Time was not linear here. It was a spiral, coiling always back toward October. I learned the rhythms of Blackfield, the way the floorboards in the west wing groaned with a different pitch when a guest was contemplating escape, the way the portrait's eyes would film over with a gray sheen, just before a new presence was drawn into our fold from the thinning places in the world. Amos and Denise avoided me. I would sometimes see them at the end of a long corridor, two pale masks flitting away into the shadows. Their fear was a constant, low-grade sustenance for the house, like a drip feed. It would not last. They would either break and become like Leona, hollowed-out fixtures, or they would be used when a greater need arose. The house would decide. I was merely its steward. My own mask was now a permanent part of my face. I knew this not because I could see it, but because I could no longer feel its edges. When I passed a darkened window, my reflection showed the smooth, white porcelain, the lopsided smile now fully formed, a perfect replica of the one I had seen for so many years. It did not feel like a disguise. It felt like my skin had finally become honest. One afternoon, I found myself in the library. The air was thick with the smell of decaying paper and old glue. The books were not for reading. They were artifacts, the physical echoes of all the lives that had been woven into the house's tapestry. I ran a gloved finger along a cracked leather spine, and a jolt of memory not mine shot up my arm. A young woman, her name was Alina, laughing in a sun-drenched field that had long since been paved over. The house had taken her in 1923. Her laughter was now a sound it could reproduce on windy nights. A ghost of a ghost. A soft, scraping sound came from the corner. I turned. One of the smaller, lumpen figures was there, the one I thought of as the gardener. It was hunched over a terracotta pot, its thick, clumsy fingers carefully patting soil around a dark, wizened seed. It was not a seed I recognized. It was black and seemed to absorb the light. "It is for the new guest," a voice said. Leona was standing in the doorway. "The house has chosen a lonely man. He lives in a quiet apartment, much like yours was. He hears whispers in his walls." I nodded. The house had been humming with a new kind of anticipation for hours. The veil was not thin, not yet, but it was stretching. A thread of connection was being spun. "When?" "Soon," she said. "The house grows impatient with the current stock." She meant Amos and Denise. Their fear was becoming stale, tinged with a despair that was less nourishing. The house preferred the sharp, bright flavor of new terror. That night, the thrumming began again, deeper and more insistent than before. I stood at the window of the grand hall, watching the graveyard. The new vine on the altar stone had grown at an impossible rate, its leaves broad and waxy, its single, nascent pumpkin already the size of a fist, glowing with a faint, internal ember. The scraping sound started in the foyer. I went to investigate. The gardener was there, dragging a large, heavy trunk across the floor. It was made of dark wood, banded with iron. With a final, grunting heave, the creature pushed it against the front door. The lock, a complex mechanism of gears and tarnished silver, slid home with a sound like a dying breath. The house fell silent. The thrumming stopped. The only sound was the frantic, panicked beating of my own heart, a human echo from a life I could barely remember. It was the silence of a trap being set. The trunk was not to keep something out. It was to ensure that when the new guest arrived, he would not be able to leave. I placed my hand on the cold wood of the trunk. I could feel a name etched into the grain, not with a tool, but with intention. Arthur. The house knew its chosen. It was always preparing. I turned and walked back toward the stairs. My duty was not to interfere, but to observe, to preside. The hunger was a knot in my own stomach. The new fear would be a feast, and I, the caretaker, would have a front row seat. The thought should have horrified me, but behind the fixed, lopsided smile, I felt only a deep, resonant agreement. The house provides. The house consumes. I am the house. The silence was broken by a faint, rhythmic tapping. It came from the other side of the front door, a hesitant, human sound. Arthur was early. The house had not yet woven its final threads. The path was not fully open. His arrival was a mistake, a crack in the ritual. A flicker of the old fear, my fear, tried to surface, a frantic moth beating against the glass of my composure. The house reacted with a surge of irritation. The green flames in the hearth spat and crackled. The portraits on the walls scowled. This was disorder. This was impurity. I descended the stairs, my movements fluid and silent. The lumpen figures began to coalesce from the shadows, their forms shifting with a low, anxious grumble. They looked to me, their new master, for guidance. The tapping turned into a knuckle rap, more insistent now. "Hello," a muffled, weary voice called through the thick oak. "Is anyone there? My car. I think I'm lost." I reached the door and stood before the heavy trunk. I could feel him on the other side, a bubble of mundane confusion and loneliness about to be popped. The house wanted to pull him in, to tear a ragged hole and claim its prize. But that would be messy. It would leave a scar. The ritual demanded elegance. My gloved hand rested on the trunk. I pushed, not with physical strength, but with a pulse of will. The lock disengaged with a soft click. The trunk slid back an inch, its weight scraping across the stone floor. The sound silenced the voice on the other side. I did not open the door. Instead, I leaned close to the wood, my mask nearly touching it. I let the house's voice, our voice, flow through me. It was no longer a rustle, but a smooth, persuasive whisper that slithered through the keyhole and under the door. "You are not lost, Arthur," the whisper cooed. "You are early. The gathering is not until Halloween. Go home. Wait for the invitation. It will find you." There was a long pause. I could feel his confusion, a tangled knot of thoughts. Then, a shiver of acceptance. The House's suggestion was taking root, a seed in fertile soil. Halloween. Yes, he mumbled to himself. I must have the date wrong. We listened as his footsteps retreated, crunching on gravel that did not exist in the outside world. The connection was not severed, only delayed. The thread was now stronger, a leash waiting to be tugged. On October 31st, he would not hesitate. He would walk through the door with a smile, eager for the party. I turned from the door. The figures had faded back into the walls, their purpose postponed. The House's irritation had cooled to a patient, predatory glee. It liked this. The anticipation made the eventual consumption sweeter. Leona was at the foot of the stairs, her head tilted. He was fragile. He would not have lasted long. "It is not about duration," I replied, walking past her. "It is about quality. His terror will be exquisite because he will have time to dream of us, to want us." I ascended the stairs, the master returning to his chamber. The house was quiet again, but it was a different quiet, a satisfied silence thick with promise. We had a guest to prepare for. We had a season to await. And I had an eternity to learn the delicate art of the hunt. The following morning, the house felt different. The air was sharper, the shadows more defined. It was as if the near break in the ritual had refined its focus, and in turn my own. I no longer simply felt the house's hunger. I understood its palate. I found Amos in the conservatory. He was trying to force open a window sealed shut by decades of paint, and something more profound, a will that made the wood as solid as stone. He jumped when I entered, his face a mess of sweat and desperation. "Please," he begged, his voice cracking. "Just let me go. I won't tell anyone. I'll say I was lost in the woods." I walked to a nearby table where a chess set was laid out, the pieces carved from bone and jet. I moved a black pawn forward one space. "There are no woods, Amos. Not anymore. Not for you." I gestured to the white pieces. "Your move." He stared at the board, then at me, his eyes wide with a dawning, horrific understanding. This was his existence now. A game, a diversion. He was a resource to be managed. He sank into the chair opposite me, his hands trembling as he reached for a white knight. We played in silence for an hour. He was a terrible player, his moves panicked and ill-conceived. Each piece he lost seemed to shrink him. I could feel the house drinking his despair, a slow, savoring sip. Later, I walked the perimeter of the graveyard. The new pumpkin was larger now, the size of a human head, its skin taking on a faint, orange hue. It pulsed with a slow, steady rhythm, a dormant heart. The gardener was there, watering the base of the vine with a rusty can that dripped a thick, dark liquid. It did not look at me, but I felt its acknowledgement, a subordinate to its commander. That night, as I sat in the high-backed chair, I felt a new sensation. A pull, not from within the house, but from beyond its walls. It was a faint, psychic tug, like a fish nibbling a line. I closed my eyes and let my consciousness follow it. I saw him, Arthur. He was in his small, tidy apartment, just as Leona had said. He was standing before his bathroom mirror, but he wasn't looking at his own reflection. He was staring at a smudge on the glass, a faint, hand-shaped smear that he could not remember making. His fear was a quiet, constant hum. He was already dreaming of us, of the invitation. He was setting a place for us at the table of his mind. I opened my eyes. The house was pleased. This was better. This was cultivation. A soft chime echoed through the hall, a sound that came from no physical bell. Dinner was served. I made my way to the dining room. The long table was set for 3. Amos and Denise were already seated, their postures rigid. A third chair at the far end was empty. It was where justice used to sit. Now it was mine. I took my place. The lumpen figures served us from tarnished silver platters. The food was always an illusion, a memory of a meal stolen from a guest long since consumed. It tasted of ash and nostalgia. Denise pushed a piece of gray meat around her plate. She had not spoken a word in days. "The house is preparing for the harvest," I said, my voice a calm statement of fact. "Your cooperation will make the transition smoother." Amos dropped his fork. It clattered loudly on the plate. Transition. What transition? The transition from guest to resident, I explained. Like Leona, it is a peaceful existence. Eventually, Denise looked up, her eyes hollow. You're a monster. I considered this. No, I was a victim. Now I am part of the ecosystem. A wolf is not a monster for hunting. It is simply a wolf. I rose from the table, leaving them with their fear and their untouched food. It was time to walk the boundaries, to feel the edges of my domain. The house needed to feel its master's presence in every brick, every shadow. As I walked, I could feel the walls sighing with contentment, the floorboards pressing up against the soles of my boots like a cat rubbing against its owner's legs. The hunger was still there, a deep, abiding constant, but it was patient now. It was sure of its next meal, and so was I. The pull from Arthur S. world grew stronger with each passing day. It was a thin, silken thread connected to my mind, and through it, I could feel the slow erosion of his sanity. He started seeing things in the periphery of his vision, a flicker of a white mask in a crowd, the distant sound of laughter that was not Leona S., but the House S. imitation of it. He began to research Blackfield, finding only vague mentions in digitized archives, just enough to convince him it was real, and that he was not hallucinating. The house was an expert angler, and he was the fish, steadily reeling himself in. I spent more time in the room with the black altar stone. The pumpkin was now a deep, vibrant orange, veined with pulsing crimson lines. It was no longer a dormant heart. It was a beating one. When I placed my hand upon it, I could feel the echo of Arthur S.'s own heartbeat, a frantic, syncopated rhythm against the pumpkin's slow, powerful thrum. The house was weaving him into its very structure. One evening, a new door appeared in the east wing. It was a plain, unvarnished thing, starkly modern against the aged wallpaper. I knew without asking that it led to a place that was not a place, a pocket of reality the house had carved out for its newest acquisition. I turned the cold, brass knob and stepped through. I was standing in a perfect replica of Arthur S.'s living room. The sofa, the bookshelf, the television were all there, rendered in muted gray tones. It was a memory, a snapshot. In the center of the room, a faint, shimmering outline of Arthur sat in his armchair, staring at a static-filled screen. This was his resonance, the psychic imprint the house was using to build the trap. Soon, this replica would be the only home he knew. The night before Halloween, the house fell into a deep and expectant hush. The very dust seemed to hold its breath. I stood at my window, watching the moon, a sharp sliver of bone in the sky. The thread connecting me to Arthur was taut, vibrating with a terrified excitement. He was packing a small bag now, convinced he was invited to a historical society gathering. He had bought a new jacket. A soft knock came at my door. It was Leona. She held a small, lacquered box. For the caretaker, she said, her voice flat. To welcome the new season. I opened the box. Inside on a bed of black velvet, lay a single withered flower. It was a Blackfield rose, a species that had not existed in the outside world for a century. Its petals were the color of midnight, and it smelled of grave soil and cold stone. As midnight strikes, you will place this on the altar, she instructed. It will be the final key. I took the box. There were no more questions to ask. The ritual was as innate to me now as breathing. Halloween dawned gray and silent. The house did not bother with the illusion of daylight. A perpetual, beautiful twilight reigned. I could feel Amos and Denise huddled together in the library, their emotional energy spent, now just hollow shells waiting to be put to use. They were part of the backdrop now, like the furniture. As the hour grew late, I made my way to the foyer. The lumpen figures were gathered, a silent, shifting honor guard. The gardener stood by the front door, its thick fingers resting on the lock. I took my position at the foot of the stairs. The Blackfield rose in my hand. The grand clock in the hall began to chime midnight. On the first chime, the gardener unlocked the door. On the second, a wind from nowhere blew it open. On the third, Arthur stood on the threshold, his face pale and confused, his new jacket looking cheap and thin against the opulent darkness of the foyer. He held a printed invitation in his hand. His eyes met mine, and I saw the moment his hope curdled into terror. He saw the mask that was my face, the lopsided smile that offered no welcome, only consumption. He saw the gathered figures, the shifting, impossible anatomy of the house itself. He tried to step back, to flee into the night, but the doorway was no longer an exit. It was a mouth. The gravel path he had walked up was gone, replaced by a solid wall of thorn-choked mist. The final chime echoed into silence. "It is time, Arthur," I said, my voice the only sound in the profound quiet. "The house is ready for you." I stepped forward, the withered rose extended. As I moved, the walls around us seemed to lean in, eager to taste his fear. This was the true beginning of my tenure. The feast was about to commence. Story 3. The hallway leading to my childhood bedroom had always been long, but now it was impossibly, suffocatingly so. The floral wallpaper, once a cheerful pattern of pink roses, seemed to stretch upwards into a dim, cobwebbed vault, the ceiling receding into a darkness that the weak October light from the window at the far end could not hope to penetrate. And the floorboards, they were narrower, the gaps between them wider, as if the house had taken a deep, settling breath and decided to become a different, more cramped entity altogether. I stood at its mouth, a 42-year-old man feeling like a 5-year-old boy, afraid of the shadows that pooled in the corners, shadows that seemed to drink the light rather than be banished by it. I had come back to Hemlock Lane because there was no one else. The call from the lawyer had been crisp and professional, a stark contrast to the ragged, wet sound of my own breathing as I listened. A car accident on a rain-slicked interstate, Instant, they said. A small mercy. Now the house was mine, or rather mine, and Alexandra S. The thought of my sister was a fresh chill in the already cold air. We hadn't spoken in 7 years, not since Dad's funeral, an event that had been less a mourning and more a final, silent war. The house was a time capsule of faded glory and persistent decay, a perfect mirror for the season. Outside, the world was a riot of autumn's last gasp. Crimson and burnt orange leaves skittered across the lawn, piling in damp, fragrant mounds against the foundation. The neighbor's porch was already adorned with a grinning jack-o'-lantern, its candle flame a winking, malevolent star in the twilight. I could smell it all through the open front door ID, yet to close behind me the sweet rot of pumpkins, the smoky tang of burning leaves from somewhere down the street, the damp, cold scent of earth preparing for winter. It was the smell of Halloween, of my childhood, of a past I had meticulously walled off. I heard her before I saw her. The crunch of her car tires on the gravel drive a deliberate announcement. Alexandra. She moved through the front door like a ghost herself, her presence altering the pressure in the room. She was thinner than I remembered, her blonde hair pulled back in a severe ponytail, her eyes the same startling blue as our mother S, but now holding a flat, assessing quality. Mario, she said, her voice devoid of warmth. She didn't offer a hug. Her gaze swept over the living room, over the dusty furniture and the boxes of our parents' lives, and I saw her jaw tighten. Alex, I replied, the name feeling foreign on my tongue. You made good time. There's nothing to keep me, she said, and the statement hung in the air, a verdict on our family. She dropped her bag by the door. Let us just get this over with. The realtor wants it staged by the end of the week. Halloween is on Tuesday. I want to be gone by then. That was Alexandra. Always with a plan, always focused on the next practical step, as if emotion were a messy inconvenience. We fell into a grim, efficient rhythm. We started in the living room, boxing up knickknacks, sorting through a lifetime of accumulated detritus. The silence between us was a physical thing, thick and heavy as the dust that coated every surface. The only sounds were the rustle of packing paper, the thud of cardboard, and the distant, happy shrieks of children playing outside in the encroaching dusk. It was on the second day, as a cold rain began to tap against the windows, that I found the first of the relics. In the back of the hall closet, behind a stack of moth-eaten winter coats, was a small wooden box. It was carved with crude, childish symbol stars, crescent moons, a stick figure cat. I knew it instantly. It was our spook box, a name we decoined as children. Inside, we used to keep our most treasured Halloween finds. A crow's feather, a strangely shaped rock, a piece of fool's gold. My fingers trembled as I lifted the lid. The smell that wafted out was not of childhood, but of dark, damp soil and something sweetly putrid. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded black velvet, was a small, porcelain doll. Its face was cracked, one eye a blank white sphere, the other a piercing, knowing blue. It was dressed in a tiny, rotten shroud of lace. I didn't remember this doll. I had no memory of it at all. Yet holding it sent a jolt of pure, animal fear through me. A sensation so immediate and visceral, I almost dropped the box. What is that? Alexandra's voice made me jump. She was standing in the doorway of the closet, her arms crossed. Nothing, I said, too quickly. I snapped the lid shut. Just some old junk from when we were kids. Her eyes lingered on the box, and for a fleeting second, I saw something in her face, not curiosity, but recognition, and a flicker of something like dread. It was gone in an instant, replaced by her usual mask of impatience. Toss it. We don't need any more clutter. But I didn't toss it. I placed it on the mantelpiece, a silent, foolish act of defiance. That night, I dreamed. I was a child again, standing at the end of that impossibly long hallway. The door to my room was open, and from within came a soft, rhythmic scraping sound, like a knife being dragged across wood. A faint, orange light pulsed from the crack beneath the door, the light of a jack-o'-lantern. I took a step forward, then another, the floorboards groaning under my weight. The scraping stopped, and from behind the door, a small porcelain voice whispered my name. I woke with a gasp, my heart hammering against my ribs. The room was freezing. The digital clock on the bedside table read 3:03 a.m. And from downstairs, I heard it a faint, distinct scrape, scrape, scrape. I told myself it was the house settling. An old pipe. The wind. But the wind didn't sound like that. I lay there until dawn, listening to the silence that followed, a silence that felt more threatening than the sound itself. The next day, the countdown to Halloween felt more pronounced. The neighbors across the street were stringing orange and purple lights. A group of teenagers were constructing a makeshift graveyard on their front lawn, laughing as they stabbed cardboard tombstones into the earth. The festive preparations felt like a mockery of the dread coiling in my gut. Alexandra and I worked in the attic, a landscape of memory shrouded in white sheets. We found more relics. My old werewolf mask, the rubber stiff and cracked, the fur matted. A stack of our childhood drawings, most of them normal, but one, drawn by Alexandra, depicted our house with a black, scribbled cloud pouring from the chimney and stick figure versions of us, with wide, screaming mouths. And then there were the photographs. We found them in a dusty album bound in cracked leather. Most were typical family shots, birthdays, Christmases, vacations. But there, nestled in the section marked October, was a series of pictures from various Halloweens. In every one, standing just at the edge of the frame, or blurred in the background, was a figure. It was never the same person. Sometimes it was a tall, thin man in a dark suit. Other times, a woman in an old-fashioned dress. But in every photo, their face was obscured by a shadow, by the flare of the camera flash, or simply turned away. They were ghosts in our family history, permanent, uninvited guests at our celebrations. Who are they? I asked, my voice a hoarse whisper. Alexandra snatched the album from me and slammed it shut. Neighbors, relatives. It doesn't matter. Her face was pale. We were wasting time. That afternoon, I went into the backyard to escape the oppressive silence of the house. The garden was a tangle of dead vegetation. A lone, gnarled oak tree stood sentinel, its bare branches clawing at the gray, low-hanging sky. And there, nestled in its roots, half hidden by a blanket of brown leaves, was a small, perfect circle of mushrooms, a fairy ring. I remembered our mother, a superstitious woman from the old country, warning us never to step inside one. It is a door, she'd whisper, her accent thickening with the tale. A door to their world. And on Halloween, the door swings both ways. As I stared at the ring, a shadow fell over me. I turned to see old Mr. Henderson, our neighbor, leaning on the rickety fence that separated our properties. He was older than God, his face a roadmap of wrinkles. Mario, he said, his voice like the rustle of dry corn husks. Heard you were back. Sorry about your folks. Thank you, Mr. Henderson. He nodded, his eyes, milky with cataracts, fixed on the fairy ring. Bad year for them, he murmured. The signs are all there. The pumpkins are rotting from the inside out all over the neighborhood. Saw a scarecrow over on Mill Road yesterday. Its head was turned the wrong way. He looked from the ring to the house, his gaze lingering on my bedroom window. This house had always had a taste for this time of year. It drinks the Halloween light. Your mother, she knew. She tried to keep it happy. The treats on the porch, the candles in the windows, they weren't tea, just for the children, you know. What are you talking about? I asked, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. He just shook his head, a slow, weary motion. The veil is thin here, boy. Always has been. It's why the shadows in there have such substance. He tapped his gnarled fingers on the fence post. Be careful what you invite in. A costume isn't just a costume on this night. A mask can become a face. With that, he turned and shuffled back towards his own house, leaving me with a fresh wave of unease. That night, the eve of Halloween, the house became restless. Doors we knew we had closed were found slightly ajar. The smell of rotting pumpkin would waft through a room with no jack-o'-lantern in it. And the whispers started. Not loud, not clear, but a sibilant hiss at the very edge of hearing, like dead leaves skittering across the floor. We were in the kitchen, eating a silent, tasteless dinner when the doorbell rang. We both jumped. It was late for visitors. I went to the door and opened it. The porch was empty, but on the welcome mat lay a single, perfect apple, its skin a deep, blood red. As I bent to pick it up, I saw a figure standing at the end of our walkway, half hidden in the shadows of a large oak. It was tall and impossibly thin, and it wore a blank, featureless mask that seemed to absorb the scant light from the street lamp. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching. Then, it raised one long, pale hand and pointed directly at me before melting back into the darkness. I slammed the door shut, my heart pounding. "Trick-or-treaters," I said to Alexandra, my voice shaking. "Late ones." She looked at me, and for the first time, I saw the mask of practicality crack completely. Raw fear stared out from her eyes. "It not them, Mario," she whispered. "It never been them." The dam between us broke then. We sat in the dusty living room, the spook box on the mantel seeming to watch us, and the story tumbled out of her in a choked, terrified rush. She told me about the things she remembered that I had apparently forgotten. The way our childhood games of hide-and-seek would sometimes include a player who wasn't us, a cold, silent presence hiding in a closet or under a bed. The year I swore I had a conversation with a scarecrow in the backyard, and it talked back. The Halloween when she was 10 and put on a witch-esque costume, a cheap, store-bought thing, and for hours after she took it off, her fingers remained stained with a green, gritty paste that wouldn't wash away. Mom and Dad knew, she sobbed, clutching a throw pillow to her chest. They called it the October feeling. They said the house got lonely the rest of the year, that on Halloween it woke up and it wanted company. They leave offerings, candy, cider. They decarve the pumpkins in a specific way, a pattern they learned from the previous owner. It was a bargain, a night of fear in exchange for a year of peace. "And you believed that?" I asked, horrified. "I didn't want to," she cried. "I left this town, and I never looked back because I didn't want to believe it. But it's true, Mario. The house not just a house. It's a threshold. And we the gatekeepers. We always have been. With Mom and Dad gone." She didn't need to finish the sentence. The understanding settled over me, cold and final. The unsettling memories weren't just grief. The malevolent presences weren't just in our heads. The childhood relics were anchors. We weren't just clearing out a house. We were disturbing a very old, very fragile equilibrium. Halloween day dawned gray and cold. The air was thick, with a damp, chilling fog that muffled all sound. The festive energy in the neighborhood had taken on a frantic, desperate edge. We worked like automatons, not speaking, the truth a heavy shroud between us. As dusk began to bleed into the sky, turning the world a deep, bruised purple, the house began to change in earnest. The hallway to my bedroom stretched again, this time so long the far end was lost in gloom. The doors along its length seemed to warp, their frames becoming crooked, their knobs shifting position. The whispers grew louder, coalescing into a single, multi-layered voice that murmured just below comprehension. The orange glow from the jack-o'-lanterns on neighboring porches cast long, dancing shadows through our windows, and these shadows did not behave like shadows should. They moved with a liquid independence, pooling in corners, and then stretching across the floor like grasping hands. We huddled in the living room, all thoughts of packing abandoned. The spook box on the mantel began to vibrate with a low, humming energy. The lid trembled. "It's time," Alexandra whispered, her face a mask of tear-streaked terror. It's hungry. The doorbell rang. Not the cheerful chime of before, but a long, insistent electric buzz that seemed to go on forever. We didn't move. It rang again and again. Then it was replaced by a soft, insistent knocking. Knock, knock, knock. I moved to the window and peered through a crack in the blinds. The porch was empty, but the street was full of them. Dozens of them. The tall, thin figures with blank masks. They stood motionless on the sidewalk, in the street, on our lawn, all facing the house. A silent, waiting congregation. The knocking stopped. And then the scraping began. It came from the front door, the sound of something sharp and hard being dragged slowly, deliberately, across the wood from the outside. A key, a claw. It wants to come in, Alexandra said, her voice eerily calm now, resigned. It's always wanted to come in all the way. Mom and Dad just let it peek through the keyhole. The scraping stopped. A profound silence fell, heavier than any sound. And then the doorknob began to turn. Slowly, deliberately. I looked at Alexandra. I looked at the spook box, which was now shaking violently on the mantel. I thought of the fairy ring, the rotting pumpkins, the photographs, the whispers. This was the revelation. The horror wasn't in the house. The house was the horror. A living, breathing entity that fed on the liminal magic of Halloween, and our family had been its caretakers, its priests, its intended feast all along. The door swung open, but there was no figure there. No monster, no ghost, just the cold, fog-laden October air. And the view from the doorway was wrong. It wasn't our familiar street with its festive decorations and silent watchers. It was a long, dark hallway, identical to the one that led to my bedroom. But this one stretched into an infinite, starless black. And from within that darkness, something began to move. Something that had been waiting. Something that had been called by the rituals of 100 Halloweens, by the fear we had sown and the offerings we had left, by the very blood in our veins. It was the end of the bargain. The year of peace was over. Alexandra screamed, a short, sharp sound that was cut off as if by a switch. I wanted to run, to fight, to do something, but I was paralyzed, caught in the hypnotic pull of that impossible hallway. I felt a coldness seep into me, not the chill of the air, but a deep, soul-numbing cold that started in my bones and spread outwards. I saw, for a fleeting, cosmic second, the true face of the thing in the dark. It was not a face of malice, but of endless, yawning hunger. It was the essence of the threshold, the thing that lives in the moment between the knock and the opening of the door, the identity behind the mask, the silence after the laughter dies. And then the world snapped back. The doorway showed only our foggy street. The silent watchers were gone. The house was still. The spook box on the mantel was quiet. Alexandra was gone. I stood there for a long time. How long I do not know, listening to the sound of my own heartbeat, a frantic rhythm against the silence. The cold had settled deep inside me, a permanent tenant. I knew with a certainty that brooked no argument, that she was not dead. She was elsewhere, fulfilling the bargain, keeping the door closed from the other side. There was nothing left to pack, nothing left to say. I walked out of the house, leaving the front door wide open behind me. I did not look back at the house on Hemlock Lane. I did not look back at the jack-o'-lanterns with their flickering, knowing grins. I walked down the driveway, my footsteps silent on the carpet of wet leaves. I walked past the fairy ring, which seemed to pulse with a faint, inner light. I walked away from the orange and black world of my childhood, a world that had always been a beautiful, terrible lie. I walked slowly, never looking back, the taste of candy corn and copper on my tongue, the cold of that final Halloween seeping into my bones, a chill that I knew, with a dread that was both terrifying and serene, would never, ever leave me. The car started on the first try, a small, mundane mercy. I drove without any destination in mind, the streets a blur of orange and black through a film of unshed tears. I passed groups of children in their costumes, little ghosts and superheroes clutching plastic buckets, their parents hovering nearby. Their laughter was muffled by the glass and the roaring in my ears. They were celebrating a safe, sanitized version of the night, a world away from the true, hungry dark I had just escaped. I found myself at a cheap motel on the edge of town, a place of flickering neon and stained carpets. The room smelled of mildew and cigarette smoke. I sat on the edge of the bed, the thin mattress sagging beneath me, and stared at my hands. They were clean. There was no physical evidence of what had happened. No struggle, no mark, no proof. Just a profound, hollow absence where my sister had been. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that infinite hallway, felt that yawning cold. I saw Alexandra's face in the moment before she vanished, not terrified anymore, but resigned, as if she had always known her fate was to be the final offering. I was the one who had forgotten. I was the one who had been spared. Why? Because I was the younger one. The one who had been better at pretending it was all just a game. When the sun finally rose, a pale, anemic light filtering through the grimy window, I knew I had to go back. I couldn't leave her there. Not really. The house would be just a house now, I told myself. The bargain was fulfilled. The door was closed. The drive back to Hemlock Lane was surreal. The morning was bright and crisp. The fog of the previous night burned away. The neighborhood was littered with the cheerful debris of the holiday trampled candy wrappers, a forgotten pirate hat in a gutter, pumpkins already beginning to sag in the daylight. It looked normal. It looked safe. I parked at the curb, my engine ticking as it cooled. The house stood silent, its windows dark. The front door was still open, just as I had left it. Taking a deep breath, I walked up the path, my shoes crunching on the gravel. The fairy ring under the oak tree was gone, just a patch of ordinary, damp earth. I stepped across the threshold. The silence inside was different. It wasn't the heavy, waiting silence of before. It was empty, truly empty. The oppressive presence was gone. The air was still and cold, but it was just air. I walked through the living room. The packing boxes were where we had left them. The spook box was still on the mantelpiece. I walked over to it, my heart thudding dully in my chest. I reached out and lifted the lid. It was empty. The porcelain doll was gone. The faded black velvet lining was all that remained. A small sound from the kitchen made me freeze. A soft, rhythmic click. I moved slowly towards the doorway, my body tensed for flight. I peered in. Alexandra was standing at the counter, her back to me. She was making coffee. The familiar, mundane sound was the coffee maker finishing its cycle. She turned, holding 2 mugs. Her face was pale and drawn, but it was her. She was here. She was solid. "Mario," she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "You came back." "Alex," I breathed, a wave of dizzying relief washing over me. You're okay. What happened? How did you get out?" She didn't answer. She just held out one of the mugs to me. I took it, my fingers brushing against hers. They were ice cold as the thing in the hallway. "I didn't get out," she said, her eyes meeting mine. They were the same shade of brown they had always been, but the light behind them was different, dimmer. The bargain is different now. It doesn't need a feast once a year. It needs a permanent presence, a keeper. She took a sip of her coffee. I stared at her, the mug feeling like a lead weight in my hand. The relief curdled into a new, deeper horror. "Mom and Dad are gone," she continued, her tone conversational, as if discussing the weather. The house needed a new anchor, so it took one. It's my house now. I can never leave. I looked around the kitchen. It was the same as yesterday, but it wasn't. The shadows in the corners were just shadows. The whispers were gone, but the house was still alive. It had just changed its diet. It was feeding on my sister, slowly, eternally. "You have to go, Mario," she said, her gaze drifting towards the window, towards the normal, sunlit street. "Take the car. Take whatever you want. Just go. And never come back to Hemlock Lane." I stood there, the warm, bitter smell of coffee filling my nostrils. I had my sister back, but I had lost her forever. The house had won. It had gotten what it wanted. A permanent resident. A living relic to add to its collection. I set the untouched mug of coffee down on the counter. I didn't know what to say. There was nothing to say. I turned and walked out of the kitchen, out of the living room, and out the front door. I didn't look back. I got in the car and drove. This time, I knew I would never return. I had escaped the Halloween horror, but I had left my sister behind in the endless October that was now her home. And as I merged onto the highway, leaving the town behind, I knew the chill in my bones was not just a memory. It was a connection, a tether to the house and to the sister who was now a part of it. A chill that would, as promised, never, ever leave me. The miles unspooled beneath the tires. A gray ribbon leading away from the town, from the house, from Alexandra. I drove until the gas light flickered on, then pulled into an anonymous station off the highway. The air outside was different. It smelled of diesel and damp concrete, not of rotting leaves and ancient fear. It felt empty, safe. I filled the tank, my movements automatic. Inside the station, I bought a bottle of water and a prepaid phone. Standing by the car, I scrolled through the contacts on my old phone, finding the number for the real estate agent. My voice was a stranger S, flat and steady, as I told her we were done, that the house and everything in it was to be sold as is. No estate sale, no final walkthrough. She asked about my sister. I said she had decided to stay. The lie was easy. It felt like something the house would have wanted me to say. I threw my old phone into a dumpster behind the station. It felt like a ritual, like cutting a cord. But as I got back into the driver's seat, the cold in my bones seemed to intensify. A deep, marrow-deep frost that the car's heater couldn't touch. It was a reminder that some cords cannot be severed. I found a small apartment in a city a state away. It was a modern box with white walls and large windows, the polar opposite of the house on Hemlock Lane. I got a job stocking shelves at night, a quiet, solitary existence. I thought I could outrun it. I thought the noise and the light and the sheer normalcy of this new place would act as an antidote. I was wrong. The first time it happened was a week after I moved in. I was taking out the trash, and in the dim glow of the security light in the alley, I saw it. A perfect, blood-red apple sitting atop the overflowing bin. My breath hitched. I looked around, my heart hammering. The alley was empty. When I looked back, the apple was gone. The whispers started a month later. Not the clear, multi-layered voice of the house, but a faint, dry rustle, like a single leaf caught in a gutter. It was always just at the threshold of hearing, coming from the next room, or just outside my door. And the cold was always there. It was my constant companion. Doctors found nothing. They called it a circulatory issue, a psychosomatic response to grief. They prescribed pills that did nothing. The chill was not of this world. It was the chill of that other place, the chill of the threshold, and it had taken root inside me. I started dreaming of the hallway. Not the one in the house, but the one I saw when the door opened. The infinite, starless black. In the dreams, I would walk down it, my footsteps making no sound. And at the far end, I would see a flicker of light. A familiar, orange, pulsing glow. The light from a jack-o'-lantern. And sometimes, just for a second, I would see a silhouette standing in that light. A woman S-shape. Alexandra. She would never turn around. I tried to date. A woman named Chloe from the coffee shop. She was bright and loud and wonderfully, blessedly normal. We went to a movie. Halfway through, I felt an icy pressure on my hand. I looked down. Nothing was there. But when I flexed my fingers, they were stiff and cold. Chloe noticed. She asked if I was okay. I couldn't explain. I stopped returning her texts. The seasons turned. Autumn came again. The city decorated, but it was a pale imitation. Paper skeletons in windows, plastic cobwebs on bushes. It felt like a mockery. As Halloween approached, the activity around me intensified. One evening, I came home from work to find my apartment door slightly ajar. I always locked it. I knew I had locked it. I pushed it open slowly. The apartment was dark, and on the floor, just inside the doorway, was a small, neatly arranged circle of candy corn. I backed away down the stairs and spent the night in a bar, drinking until the world blurred. It didn't help. The cold was sharper than ever, a sober, crystalline clarity in the center of my drunkenness. I finally understood. I hadn't escaped. The house had simply found a more efficient way to sustain itself. It didn't need me inside its walls. It had planted a piece of itself inside me. I was a satellite, a source. The fear I carried, the permanent winter in my soul, was a steady drip feed for whatever lived in that darkness. Alexandra was the anchor, but I was the conduit. On Halloween night, I sat in my dark apartment, the lights off, the blinds drawn. I didn't answer the door for the children whose laughter echoed in the hallway. I just sat in my chair, feeling the cold radiate from my bones, listening to the faint, skittering whisper from the other side of the room. I was a haunted man, but the ghost was me. I was a living Halloween, a perpetual echo of that final night on Hemlock Lane, and I knew, with a certainty that was as cold as my own blood, that this was my forever. Not a single night of terror, but a lifetime of chill. The house had kept its bargain. It had given me my life, and in return, it was feeding on me slowly, eternally, from a distance. The door had never really closed. I had just carried a piece of it away with me. The next morning, the whispers were gone. The candy corn had vanished. The apartment was just an apartment again, silent and sterile. The sudden normalcy was more frightening than the phenomena. It was a cycle, a period of quiet followed by a reminder, a harvest. I called in sick to work. The thought of being around people, of pretending to be part of their world, was unbearable. I sat at my small kitchen table, watching the steam rise from a mug of tea I knew I would not drink. The chill in my hands made the warm ceramic feel like a lie. I had to know. I had to know if she was still there in that house, or if what I had seen that morning was just a shell, a puppet animated by the house's will. I opened my laptop, my fingers clumsy with cold. It took me hours, sifting through property records, obituaries, old community newsletters, anything I could find online about Hemlock Lane. I found my parents' obituaries. They were brief, citing a private, sudden illness. The date was the same for both. The morning after Halloween, 5 years ago. The year the peace was broken. They hadn't run. They had paid the price for a lapse in the ritual. Their lives had been the feast. Then I found it. A small, grainy picture from a local newspaper's archive. A piece on the Historical Society. The photo was of a woman standing on the porch of a Victorian house, but it wasn't our house. The caption read, "Local historian Alexandra Miles at the Peabody House, circa 1982. It was my sister, but it wasn't. The woman was older, her hair styled differently, but the face was unmistakably Alexandra S. The date was 40 years ago. My breath caught in my throat, a sharp, icy knot. I scrolled further, my heart a frantic drum against the silence of the room. Another article from 1975. A wedding announcement. Alexandra Miles to James Turner. A picture of the bride. My sister, smiling a smile I had never seen. The house didn't just take one sister. It took daughters. It took them across generations, replacing them when the previous one was used up, weaving their stories into its own, making their faces its own. The Alexandra I had grown up with, the one I had tried to save, was just the latest in a long, long line. She wasn't my sister. She was the current resident, the current offering. And the thing in the dark, the thing that was the house, had worn her face to make the betrayal complete. I closed the laptop. The cold inside me wasn't just a connection anymore. It was an inheritance, a lineage. I wasn't a conduit. I was a spare, a backup kept in reserve, living a half-life in the outside world until the house needed a new face, a new story, a new keeper for its endless hunger. I got up and walked to the window, pulling back the blind. The sun was shining on the street below. People were walking their dogs, heading to work, living their lives. They had no idea that the man in the window above was a ghost in waiting, a future memory for a hungry house on a street that didn't exist on any real map. I let the blind fall back into place, plunging the room into a gloom that suited me. There was nowhere left to run. The horror wasn't a place I could leave. It was the blood in my veins and the chill in my bones. It was my name. It was my future. I was just waiting for my turn to come home. The knowledge settled not with a shock, but with a grim, final weight, like a stone sinking to the bottom of a frozen lake. I had spent a year running from a ghost, only to discover I was the ghost. My life was not my own. It was a placeholder, a temporary lease on a reality that could be revoked at any moment. I quit my job. There was no point. I stopped paying rent. When the eviction notice came, I didn't fight it. I packed a single bag, though I owned little worth taking. The rest I left for the landlord to deal with. On my last day in the apartment, I stood in the empty living room. The whispers had started again, a soft, sibilant chorus from the bare corners. They didn't sound threatening anymore. They sounded like a welcome. I didn't drive. I left the car in the parking lot, the keys in the ignition. Let someone else have it. Let it be their problem. I walked to the bus station, the cold inside me a compass needle pointing only one way. I bought a ticket with the last of my cash, a one-way trip to a town 50 miles from Hemlock Lane. The journey was a blur of gray landscapes and muffled sounds. The cold was so profound now that the outside temperature no longer registered. From the bus station, I walked. It took 2 days. I slept in ditches, the chill in my bones keeping me safe from the autumn damp. I didn't eat. I wasn't hungry. I was being called, and the call was a sustenance of its own. I arrived at the edge of town at dusk on October 30th. The air was different here, thicker. It tasted of wet earth and decaying pumpkins, a flavor I realized I had missed. I walked the familiar streets, unseen, a shadow among the preparations. People were hanging cardboard witches in their windows and stretching fake cobwebs over their shrubs. They were playing at fear. I had forgotten how to play. I turned onto Hemlock Lane. The street was quiet, holding its breath. The houses were dark, except for one. Our house. A single light burned in an upstairs window. Alexandra's window, or the window of the thing that wore her face. The front door was closed. I didn't try the knob. I knew it would be locked to me. I was not the keeper, not yet. I walked around to the back, to the old oak tree. The fairy ring was there again, a perfect circle of pale, phosphorescent mushrooms pushing through the fallen leaves. They pulsed softly, in time with the cold in my chest. I sat down with my back against the rough bark of the tree, facing the house. This was as close as I could get. For now, I could feel the house's awareness like a pressure against my skin. It knew I was here. It was waiting. The night deepened. The wind picked up, rustling the dead leaves, but around the fairy ring, the air was perfectly still. I watched the light in the upstairs window. Once, a shadow passed across it. A tall, slender silhouette. It paused, and I felt its gaze upon me, out here in the dark. There was no recognition in that look, only a kind of patient assessment. The look of farmer gives a field he knows will be ready for harvest soon. I didn't move. I didn't sleep. I sat there as the moon crossed the sky and the world grew cold. I sat there as the first hints of dawn tinged the horizon. This was my vigil, my acknowledgement. The chill was no longer a curse. It was a preparation. It was the soil in which I was being resewn. Tomorrow was Halloween. The door would be open, not the physical door, but the true one. And this time, I would not be running away. I would be walking in, not as a victim, not as a sacrifice, but as what I was always meant to be. The next in line. The story that was waiting to be told. The cold was no longer inside me. I was inside the cold. And soon, I would be home. The sun rose, a pale and watery eye in a gray sky. The light did nothing to warm me. I was beyond temperature now. The day passed in a single, held breath. No one came to the house. No mail was delivered. No trick-or-treaters would brave this end of the lane, not tonight. The world had drawn a circle around this place, and I was now firmly within it. As twilight bled into a deep, starless purple, the house began to change. The peeling paint seemed to smooth itself. The sagging porch straightened. The light in the upstairs window winked out, and a new one bloomed in the parlor, a warm, golden, inviting glow. It was the house, as I remembered it from my earliest childhood, before I knew the price of that warmth. The front door swung open silently. No force pushed it. It was simply an invitation. I stood up from the base of the tree, my joints not stiff from the cold, but fluid, as if I were moving through water. I walked across the lawn, my feet making no sound on the damp grass. I paused at the threshold. The hallway within was not the dark, menacing passage from my memory. It was clean, well-lit, smelling of lemon polish and my Mother S perfume. She stood there, just inside. Alexandra. She looked exactly as she had the morning I left, but her eyes were different. The dim light was gone, replaced by a flat, polished emptiness, like old varnish. "You ate just in time, Mario," she said. Her voice was a perfect imitation of my sister S, but it came from a great distance. "It's almost ready." She turned and walked down the hall. I followed. The house was perfect, a museum of a happy life. I saw the framed photos on the wall, pictures of a childhood I now knew was a fabrication, a story written to make the ending hurt more. She led me into the dining room. The table was set for two. Fine china, silver cutlery, crystal glasses filled with dark red wine. A single candelabra cast a dancing light. In the center of the table, where a roast might have been, sat the music box. Its lid was open. It was no longer empty. Inside, nestled on the black velvet, was a miniature porcelain figure. A boy with my face, frozen in a look of serene acceptance. "Sit," the thing-wearing Alexandra said. I pulled out a heavy wooden chair and sat. She sat across from me. She picked up her wine glass. "A toast," she said, "to coming home, to taking your place." I looked from the tiny porcelain version of myself to her hollow eyes. This was the feast, not a violent consumption, but a quiet, formal assimilation. I was to be made part of the collection, my essence siphoned into that small doll, my story added to the library of lies the house told itself. I reached for my own wine glass. My fingers, once so cold, were now the same temperature as the crystal. I lifted it. "To the house," I said. I did not drink. Instead, I threw the wine into the candle flames. There was a sharp, hissing crackle, and the room plunged into a profound darkness, but only for a second. The illusion shattered. The fine dining room vanished. We were in a dusty, decaying room. The table was a warped plank of wood. The china was shards on the floor. The thing across from me was no longer my sister. It was a tall, slender form of shifting shadows and remembered faces, my parents' features flickering over its surface before dissolving back into the dark. Its eyes were the only constant, 2 points of absolute blackness that drank the light. It let out a sound that was not a scream, but the sound of a foundation cracking. I stood up. The cold was gone. In its place was a terrible, clear stillness. I had not come to be consumed. I had come to reclaim. "You took my family," I said, my voice steady in the thick silence. "You took my life, but you made one mistake. You let a piece of you live inside me, and I learned its shape. I took a step toward it. It recoiled, the shadows that formed it writhing. I am not the next course," I said. "I am the poison." I reached out my hand, not to strike it, but to touch it. My fingers, which had carried its chill for a year, now felt like ice to the thing itself. As my skin made contact with the shifting darkness, the cold that had been my curse flowed back into it, but changed. It was no longer a nutrient. It was a truth. The truth of its own endless, parasitic existence. The house around us groaned. The walls trembled. Plastered dust rained from the ceiling. The shadow thing shrieked, a sound of tearing fabric and breaking glass, and then it imploded, collapsing inward upon itself, until there was nothing left but a stain on the floorboards and a final, fading whisper. The front door blew open with a bang. I walked out of the house, down the porch steps, and did not look back. I stood in the center of Hemlock Lane. The perfect, haunted houses on either side of the street began to blur, their edges softening like a photograph left in the rain. One by one, they faded, until there was only an empty field under a cold moon, and a single, forlorn oak tree where my house had once stood. The bargain was broken. The anchor was gone. I was free. But as I turned to walk towards the distant lights of the real town, I felt a new sensation. Not the invasive cold of the house, but a hollow, echoing space inside me where it had been. I had destroyed my prison, but I had also destroyed the only home I had ever known. I was free, but I was also, and would always be, utterly alone. The chill was gone, but the silence it left behind was its own kind of haunting. The walk back to town was longer than the walk out. The world seemed heavier, more solid. The gravel of the real road crunched under my shoes with a definitive sound. When I reached the first street lamp, its electric glow felt harsh and alien. I found a motel on the outskirts, a place with buzzing neon and thin walls. I paid for a week with the last few crumpled bills in my pocket, the money I had saved for a life that was no longer mine. For days, I did nothing but sleep. The silence in the room was absolute. No whispers, no skittering, no phantom cold. It was the silence of a vacuum. I would lie awake for hours, listening to the absence of the thing that had been my constant companion. The hollow space inside me ached. I got a job washing dishes at a diner. The work was mindless, my hands submerged in hot, soapy water for hours. The heat should have been a comfort, but my skin felt numb, as if it had forgotten how to feel warmth. People talked around me, but their words seemed to slide off, unable to stick. I was a stone at the bottom of a river, unmoved by the current. Weeks bled into months. The seasons turned once more. Spring came, then summer. The world was lush and green and teeming with life, a celebration I was not invited to. I rented a small room above a garage. It was plain, with white walls and a single window. I kept it clean and empty. I owned nothing that could hold a memory. One evening in late August, I was walking back from the diner. The air was warm and thick with the smell of cut grass and barbecue. A group of children ran past, their laughter sharp and clear in the twilight. One of them, a little girl with brown pigtails, tripped and fell on the sidewalk just ahead of me. She let out a small cry. I stopped. Instinctively, I took a step toward her. As I did, the air around me grew cold. A localized pocket of winter, just for a second. The girl's mother rushed over, scooping her up, and shot me a wary, confused look before hurrying away. I stood frozen on the sidewalk. The chill was gone as quickly as it had come, but the truth of it remained. I had brought it with me. Not the house, not the entity, but the cold was a part of me, a talent I had learned from my tormentor. The house was gone, but its lessons remained. I had become the thing I had destroyed. I carried my own haunted weather with me. I continued walking, my hands shoved deep in my pockets. I understood now that freedom was not an absence. It was a choice. I could live in this numb, silent world, a ghost among the living. Or I could use what I had learned. The cold could push people away, but it could also be a shield. It could be a tool. The hollow space inside me wasn't just an emptiness. It was a capacity. I reached my room and closed the door. The silence welcomed me. I went to the window and looked out at the town, at the lights coming on in the houses, each one a story, a life. I was not part of it. I would never be part of it. But I was no longer a victim of a story. I was its author. The chill was mine to command. The haunting was my inheritance. And for the first time since I had walked away from that empty field, the silence did not feel like loneliness. It felt like power. I started small. A persistent draft in the apartment of the diner's owner, a man who skimmed tips and spat in the soup. The cold followed him from room to room, a private winter he could not escape. He became jumpy, paranoid. He sold the diner a month later. I felt a flicker of something when I heard the news. It wasn't warmth. It was satisfaction. I practiced. I learned to focus the chill, to shape it. I could make a glass of water frost over from across a room. I could make a single, frozen word form on a window pane. The hollow space inside me was not empty. It was a reservoir, and I was learning to tap it. I left the town and moved on. I found places where the fabric of the world was thin, where sadness and anger had worn it through. A forgotten stretch of railroad where a tragedy had occurred. A boarded-up theater where a singer had lost her voice and her life. These places called to the cold in me, and I answered. I would sit in the silence of these spots and let the chill seep out, not to feed a monster, but to cleanse. The cold could preserve, but it could also numb. It could make a memory so sharp it cut, or so distant it lost its power to hurt. People began to talk, of course. Whispers of a quiet man who could fix things, not by building, but by quieting. A landlord with a predatory gleam in his eye would suddenly find his building plagued by an unshakable, bone-deep chill until he broke his own leases and fled. A playground bully would wake every night, his room freezing, until he confessed his cruelties through chattering teeth. They didn't know my name. They called me other things, the frost, the stillness. I preferred the latter. One autumn evening, I found myself in a new city, drawn to a particular street. The houses were close together, and in one, a family was screaming at each other. The sound was a physical thing, clawing at the night. A man and a woman, their faces twisted with a decade of resentment. while a small boy huddled on the stairs, his hands over his ears. I stood under a street lamp across the road. I closed my eyes and reached for the reservoir within. I didn't push the cold out. I let it flow, a gentle, insistent tide, directed not at the people, but at the anger itself. I focused on the heat of their rage, and I cooled it. The shouting didn't stop abruptly. It faded like a radio signal losing strength. The words slurred, lost their venom. I opened my eyes. Inside the house, the man and woman were standing in the middle of their living room, shivering. They looked at each other, confused, their fury extinguished by a sudden, profound chill. The man stumbled to the thermostat, rapping it with his knuckle. The boy on the stairs slowly lowered his hands, his eyes wide. The woman, her arms wrapped around herself, looked out the window. Her gaze passed over me, but she didn't see me. She saw only the cold night. She turned away and walked to the boy, pulling him into an embrace. It was awkward, unpracticed, but it was a start. I turned and walked away, my breath a pale plume in the air. The hollow space inside me felt a little less empty. I was not a hero. I was a correction, a counterbalance. The house on Hemlock Lane had used cold and silence to consume and to lie. I would use them to preserve and to reveal the truth. My family was gone, my past a fiction, but my future was my own. I was the stillness after the storm. I was the silence that speaks volumes, and I was just getting started.